Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The night I saw those footprints was the night everything changed. I'd been a forest ranger for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Cascade Mountains that cold autumn evening. It was just past midnight when I set out on my routine patrol. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. My breath formed small clouds in front of me as I walked, flashlight in hand, scanning the forest floor for any signs of disturbance. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of earth and undergrowth as I moved along the trail. I'd done this route 100 times before, but something felt different that night. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling of small animals in the bushes. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something odd on the ground. At first, I thought it was just a depression in the mud, maybe left by a deer or elk. But as I crouched down to examine it closer, my blood ran cold. It was a footprint, all right, but not like any I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was incredibly heavy. But what really got me was the shape. It looked almost human, with 5 distinct toe marks, but the proportions were all wrong. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I swept my flashlight across the ground, looking for more prints. Sure enough, there was another one about 6 feet ahead, and another beyond that. They formed a clear trail leading deeper into the woods. Every instinct told me to turn back, to radio for backup and wait for daylight. But curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what could have made those tracks. As I followed the trail, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, as I moved from one print to the next. The trail led me off the main path and into a part of the forest I wasn't as familiar with. The underbrush was thicker here, and I had to push through branches and vines to keep following the prints. My uniform snagged on thorns, and I could feel scratches forming on my exposed skin. Suddenly, I heard a loud crack echoing through the trees. I froze, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as my hand shook. It sounded like a branch breaking. But not just any branch. This was the sound of something massive stepping on a fallen log and crushing it underfoot. I held my breath, straining my ears for any follow-up sound. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a cougar, not any animal I could identify. My hand instinctively went to the holster on my hip, but I knew my sidearm would be useless against whatever was out there. I started to back away slowly, trying to retrace my steps without making a sound. That's when I saw it, just for a second, illuminated by my flashlight beam as it swung wildly in my shaking hand, a pair of eyes reflecting the light, set high above the ground. Much higher than any normal animal, they blinked once and then were gone. I turned and ran. I didn't care about stealth anymore. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my lungs burning as I gulped in the cold night air. I could hear movement behind me, the sound of something large pursuing through the forest. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Eventually, I burst out onto the main trail, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, fumbling with the keys before practically diving inside and locking the doors. As I sat there, engine idling and heater blasting, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe the darkness and my fear had played tricks on my eyes, But I knew deep down that wasn't the case. Those footprints were undeniably humanoid, yet far too large to belong to any person. And those eyes, they had an intelligence behind them that chilled me to my core. I reported the incident, of course. My supervisor listened patiently as I recounted my experience, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He sent out a team to investigate the area the next day, but they found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anything unusual had passed through. In the weeks that followed, I questioned my sanity more than once. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was the stress of the job finally getting to me? But every time I closed my eyes, I could see those footprints in the mud, could hear that bone-chilling growl echoing through the trees. I started carrying a camera with me on my patrols after that night, hoping to capture evidence if I ever encountered anything similar again. But the forest seemed to have returned to normal. The familiar sounds of wildlife returned, and my routes were uneventful. It wasn't until about a month later that something strange happened again. I was checking the trail cameras we had set up to monitor wildlife movements when I noticed one of them had been damaged. The casing was cracked, and the memory card was missing. As I examined the damaged camera, I noticed something stuck in the broken plastic. It was a tuft of hair, coarse and long, unlike anything I'd seen on the local wildlife. I carefully removed it and placed it in an evidence bag, my hands shaking slightly as I sealed it. I sent the hair sample to a lab for analysis, not really expecting much to come of it. When the results came back a few weeks later, I was stunned. The report stated that the hair didn't match any known species in their database. The DNA was similar to primate hair, but with significant anomalies that the scientists couldn't explain. This discovery reignited my determination to find out what was really going on in these woods. I began spending more of my free time in the forest, setting up my own cameras and searching for signs of the creature I'd encountered. My colleagues started to give me odd looks, whispering behind my back about how I'd become obsessed. Maybe they were right, but I couldn't let it go. I knew what I'd seen, and I was determined to prove it. As the months passed, I collected more evidence, more unexplained footprints, strange hair samples, and even a few blurry photos from my trail cameras that showed a large, dark shape moving through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. I've shared my findings with a few trusted researchers and cryptozoologists, but I've been careful about going public with the information. I've seen how quickly people can be ridiculed and dismissed for claiming to have seen something unexplainable, but I know what's out there. I've seen it with my own eyes, heard it with my own ears. There's something in these woods that defies explanation, something that shouldn't exist but does, and I won't rest until I uncover the truth. Every time I put on my uniform and head out into the forest now, I feel a mix of excitement and fear. Will this be the day I come face to face with the creature again? Will I finally get the proof I need to convince the world of its existence? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. There are things out there, hidden in the shadows of the trees, that challenge everything we think we know about the natural world. And I, for one, am determined to bring them into the light. As I write this, I'm preparing for another night patrol. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the forest. I check my gear one last time: flashlight, camera, evidence collection kit, everything I need to document any unusual findings. I can't help but wonder what this night will bring. Will it be another uneventful patrol? Or will I finally come face to face with the creature that's been haunting these woods and my dreams for all these months? Whatever happens, I'll be ready, because now I know the truth. There are mysteries in this world that go beyond our understanding, creatures that exist on the fringes of our reality, and I've made it my mission to uncover them, one footprint at a time. Story 2. I had been working as a forest ranger for over 10 years, and I thought I'd seen just about everything the woods could throw at me. Bears rummaging through campsites, wolves howling in the distance, even the occasional lost hiker who somehow wandered off the beaten path. But there was one thing I had never encountered before, something that still gives me chills every time I think about it. It all started on what should have been a routine patrol. The call came in around 3 p.m. A hiker had reported seeing some strange structures in a restricted part of the forest. We occasionally got complaints like that, people seeing teepees made from branches, or even crude huts. Usually, it was kids messing around, but this particular section of the forest wasn't accessible to the general public. It was remote, no trails leading to it, and even seasoned hikers stayed clear of that area. The thing that bothered me the most, though, was the way the report was phrased. The hiker didn't say, "Someone's been building things." He said, "Something's building things." I tried to shake off the unease as I grabbed my gear and headed out. The drive into the forest took about an hour. The road narrowed, the trees becoming denser and darker, blotting out the late afternoon sun. When I finally parked the truck, the quiet hit me. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just that eerie, oppressive silence. I grabbed my radio, checked my flashlight. Everything was in order. I'd done this 100 times. The only difference was that little knot of tension in my stomach that I couldn't quite shake. The walk to the area where the hiker had reported the structures was longer than I expected. The undergrowth was thick, and the further I got from the truck, the more overgrown the path became. It was as though the forest itself hadn't been touched in years. My boots crunched over leaves and sticks, and the occasional snap of a branch made me jump more than I'd like to admit. Finally, I found it. A small clearing, just big enough for maybe a campfire or two, with a crude structure made out of fallen logs and branches. But it wasn't like anything I'd seen before. The logs weren't simply stacked or leaned up against each other. They were arranged, woven together, almost like a cage. It was intricate, deliberate, too deliberate for something casual. I knelt down to inspect the ground, looking for any footprints or signs that someone had been here recently, but there were none. The leaves on the forest floor were undisturbed, save for a few odd indentations, like something heavy had been dragged. I snapped a few photos with my phone and made a mental note to check the area again later. That's when I spotted it. Hidden behind the strange structure, about 10 feet away, was a trail camera. Now that camera wasn't supposed to be there. Our department had placed cameras throughout the park, sure, but none in this area, and definitely not this model. This one was old, weathered, and partially obscured by moss. It looked like it had been sitting there for years. I approached the camera cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Why was this here? And more importantly, who had put it here? My fingers brushed against the camera, and I realized it wasn't even locked in place properly. I pulled it off the tree with a little effort, half expecting it to crumble in my hands, but it was still functional. The memory card was intact. I decided to bring it back with me. If someone had been monitoring this part of the forest, maybe they had captured something or someone on tape. The sun was beginning to set as I made my way back to the truck. That eerie silence was still there, but now it felt more intentional, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Every step I took felt heavier, like the woods were closing in around me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something trailing behind me, but there was nothing, just trees, just silence. By the time I reached the truck, it was nearly dark. I tossed the camera in the passenger seat, fired up the engine, and headed back to the ranger station. I told myself that I was overreacting. It was just an old camera, probably left by some researchers who had forgotten about it, but that didn't explain the strange structure or why the hiker had said something had built it. Back at the station, I plugged the memory card into my laptop, my heart racing. The card was almost full. There were hundreds of videos, most of them no more than a few seconds long. I started clicking through them, one by one. At first, there was nothing unusual, just standard shots of wildlife, deer, squirrels, the occasional fox. But then, about halfway through, things started to get weird. One video showed something large moving in the distance. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but it was big, bigger than any animal native to this area. I paused the video and rewound it, trying to get a better look, but the quality was poor, and the figure disappeared behind the trees before I could make anything out. The next few videos were more of the same. Something large, moving through the forest, always just out of sight, and then I found the last video. It was different. The camera had been moved, knocked over by something, and now it was angled toward the ground. For a while, all I could see was dirt and leaves. But then, after a few minutes, something stepped into frame. It was a foot, a huge, clawed foot, covered in matted fur. I stared at the screen, frozen. The foot moved closer, and then something reached down, something with long, gnarled fingers, and ripped the camera off the tree. The video cut to black. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? My first thought was that it was a hoax, that someone had gone through a lot of trouble to plant that camera and fake the footage. But that didn't explain the structure I'd found, or the fact that the camera looked like it had been sitting there for years. I needed answers. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back to the truck, determined to return to the site. I don't know what I was thinking, going back into the woods at night, but something in me just couldn't let it go. I had to know what was out there. The drive back was tense. Every shadow seemed darker, every rustle of leaves more sinister. When I reached the trailhead, I hesitated for just a moment before stepping out of the truck. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't do much to ease the growing sense of dread in my chest. I walked quickly, my breath coming in short, nervous bursts. The woods felt different at night, like they were alive in a way they weren't during the day. And that silence, that oppressive, suffocating silence, was back. It didn't take long to reach the clearing. The structure was still there, untouched. I stood at the edge of the clearing, my flashlight sweeping over the strange construction. For a moment, I considered turning back. But something inside me, the same thing that had driven me to come here in the first place, pushed me forward. I stepped into the clearing, and that's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep that I felt it in my chest before I even registered the sound. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing, just darkness. The growl came again, closer this time. My heart was pounding in my ears. I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light, a massive figure stood watching me. It was tall, taller than any human, with broad shoulders and a hunched posture. Its eyes, two pinpricks of reflected light, glinted in the darkness. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, sprinting through the trees, branches slapping against my face, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I slammed the door shut and peeled out of there, my heart still racing. The image of that thing burned into my mind. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there. Maybe it was just a bear, or maybe it was something else, something that doesn't belong in our world. But whatever it was, it's still out there. And every time I patrol that part of the forest, I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me, waiting. Story 3. Camping in the wilderness is supposed to be peaceful, a way to disconnect from the world, to escape the chaos of everyday life. That's what my friend Tom and I were looking for when we decided to spend a weekend deep in the woods. But what we found was something entirely different, something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It started out like any other camping trip. Tom and I had been planning this for weeks. We picked a remote spot in a national forest, far from any established campgrounds or hiking trails. The goal was isolation. We wanted quiet, nothing but the sounds of nature to fill the air. So we drove for hours, parked at the end of a dusty forest road, and hiked for another couple of miles into the thick of the woods. The spot we chose was perfect, a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small stream trickling nearby. It felt like we had stepped into a postcard. the kind you see on nature blogs. There was no cell service, no other people, just us and the trees. We set up camp quickly, pitched our tents, and got a fire going. The first night was exactly what we wanted. Stars overhead, the crackling of the fire, and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. We sat around the fire, talking about life, work, and all the usual things. I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in months, but that all changed the next morning. I woke up early, the sun just starting to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. Tom was still asleep in his tent, snoring softly. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the crisp morning air. As I stretched, I noticed something strange in the dirt around our camp. Footprints. At first, I thought they might be from us. Maybe we had walked around the camp more than I remembered. But as I crouched down to get a better look, I realized they weren't ours. They were much larger, deeper, and spaced farther apart than any tracks we could have made. The prints circled our tents, as if someone or something had been walking around us while we slept. My heart started pounding. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone watching us, but there was no one, just the silence of the forest. "Hey, Tom," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Wake up! You need to see this!" Tom groaned from inside his tent, but after a few seconds, he unzipped it and poked his head out. "What's going on?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. I gestured to the ground. "Look." He got up and shuffled over to where I was standing. His sleepy expression quickly shifted to confusion as he crouched down to inspect the prints. What the hell?" he muttered, running his fingers through the dirt. "These aren't ours." "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We both stared at the tracks for a few moments, our minds racing with questions. Who had been out here in the middle of the night? Why didn't we hear anything? And more importantly, where were they now? Tom stood up, brushing dirt off his hands. Maybe it was just some hikers passing through," he suggested. But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe it. There were no trails anywhere near us, and the footprints didn't lead to or from any direction. They just circled our tents, as if someone had stood there watching us sleep. "We would have heard them," I said, shaking my head. "Whoever, or whatever, this was, they were careful." Tom glanced around nervously. Maybe we should pack up and head back to the truck." I nodded, but part of me didn't want to leave. It was as if I needed to know more. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like if we left now, we'd never get any answers. And a small part of me didn't want to feel afraid of the woods. This was supposed to be our retreat, our escape. "Let's stay another night," I suggested, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince Tom or myself. We'll keep a closer watch tonight. Maybe it was nothing." Tom hesitated, looking at the tracks again, then back at me. "Fine," he sighed. "But if anything else weird happens, we're out of here first thing in the morning." The rest of the day was quiet. We tried to go about our business as usual, hiking, cooking over the fire, even joking around to lighten the mood, but I could feel the tension between us. Every time a twig snapped in the distance or the wind rustled the leaves, we both froze, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Night fell, and the woods around us grew darker than I remembered from the night before. The trees seemed to close in on us, the shadows stretching longer, deeper. We sat by the fire again, but this time there was no easy conversation, just silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of burning wood. We turned in early, both of us too uneasy to enjoy the night like we had before. As I lay in my tent, staring up at the dark fabric above me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept listening for footsteps, for any sign that someone was out there. Hours passed, and just when I started to drift off, I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed. At first, I thought it might just be the wind, but then it grew louder, closer. Something was moving around the campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching over the dry leaves and twigs. They were close, too close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps circled the tent, just like the prints we had found that morning. I could hear the faint shuffling of dirt, the snap of twigs underfoot. Whoever was out there was walking slowly, methodically, as if they were inspecting the camp. I wanted to call out to Tom, but fear held me back. What if whoever or whatever was out there heard me? What if I was the next target? I lay there, motionless, listening to the footsteps grow fainter as they moved away from my tent. But then, just as I thought it was over, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The zipper of Tom's tent, slowly, agonizingly, being pulled open. I shot up in my sleeping bag, my heart hammering in my chest. "Tom!" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. "Tom!" I said louder this time, fumbling with my flashlight. I scrambled out of my tent and turned the beam toward his. His tent was empty. The flap was open, the zipper halfway undone. I rushed over, panic surging through me. "Tom!" I shouted, louder now, my voice echoing through the trees. There was no sign of him. His sleeping bag was still inside, crumpled up, but he was gone. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. "Tom!" I yelled again, my voice breaking, and then I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light of the flashlight. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with broad shoulders and long limbs. It stood there, motionless, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I was paralyzed with fear. Then instinct took over. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the campsite, didn't care about leaving the tents or the gear behind. I just ran. Branches whipped at my face, the underbrush snagging at my legs, but I didn't stop. I ran blindly through the woods, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know if Tom was still out there somewhere. All I knew was that I had to get away. I don't remember how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Eventually, I stumbled out onto the dirt road where we had parked the truck. I collapsed against the side of the truck, gasping for breath, my body shaking with adrenaline. I never found Tom. I called for search and rescue the next day, told them everything I could. They searched the area for days, but they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of struggle, just an empty campsite and 2 sets of tents. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was some kind of animal, or maybe it was something else, something that doesn't belong in those woods. All I know is that I'll never go camping again, and I'll never stop wondering what I saw at the edge of that clearing, standing there watching. Story 4. The screams that tore through the night air were unlike anything I'd ever heard before. They weren't the playful shrieks of campers telling ghost stories, or even the startled yelp of someone encountering wildlife. No, these were primal, filled with raw terror that made my blood run cold. I bolted upright in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. My wife, Sarah, was already scrambling for the flashlight. "Oh, did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my own fear in check. "It came from the direction of that other campsite, the one with the young couple." We had arrived at Whispering Pines campground earlier that day, looking forward to a peaceful weekend getaway. The campground was fairly empty, with only a handful of other campers scattered throughout the area. We had noticed a young couple, probably in their early 20s, setting up their tent about 100 yards from us. They had seemed cheerful, excited for their outdoor adventure. Now, as another blood-curdling scream pierced the night, that cheerful scene seemed like a distant memory. I unzipped our tent, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence that followed the screams. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Be careful," she pleaded. I nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping out into the cool night air. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. I could make out the shapes of trees and our car, but everything seemed different in the silvery light, full of shadows and potential hiding spots. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding weak and uncertain. "Is everyone okay over there?" No response. I looked back at Sarah, who was peering out of the tent, her face pale in the moonlight. "I'm going to check it out," I told her. "Stay here and lock up the tent. If you hear anything strange, get in the car and honk the horn." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. I handed her the car keys and our second flashlight, then started making my way towards the other campsite. The forest was unnaturally quiet as I walked. No crickets chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire woods were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. As I approached the other campsite, I called out again. "Hello? Anyone there? We heard screaming. Are you all right?" Still no answer. I swept my flashlight beam across the area, and what I saw made my stomach lurch. The young couple's tent was in tatters, ripped apart as if by some enormous force. Sleeping bags and personal belongings were strewn about, some items hanging from nearby tree branches. "Oh God," I muttered, my hand shaking as I held the flashlight. What could have done this? I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the ground. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were everywhere, crisscrossing the campsite in chaotic patterns. Some looked human, probably belonging to the young couple, but others were much larger, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear attack. But bears don't usually leave footprints like this, and they certainly don't tear tents apart in this manner. I was so focused on the footprints that I almost missed the blood. It was a small puddle, dark and glossy in the moonlight, just at the edge of the destroyed campsite. A trail of droplets led away from it, disappearing into the dense forest beyond. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get back to our tent and Sarah, to drive away from this place as fast as we could. But what if the young couple was out there, injured and in need of help? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and followed the blood trail into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every snapping twig under my feet sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. I had only gone about 50 yards when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as my hand shook. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" The growl came again, louder this time, and accompanied by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. It was close, too close. I turned to run, but my foot caught on a root and I went down hard, the flashlight flying from my hand. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. In the darkness, I could hear whatever it was getting closer. Heavy footsteps, branches snapping, that terrible growl growing louder. I ran blindly, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning as I gulped in the cold night air. I burst out of the tree line back into our campsite, nearly colliding with Sarah, who was standing outside our tent with a look of terror on her face. "What happened?" she cried. I heard noises. I was about to honk the horn. "We need to go," I gasped, grabbing her arm and pulling her towards the car. "Now!" We threw ourselves into the vehicle, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, we heard it, that bone-chilling growl, now right at the edge of our campsite. Sarah screamed as a huge, dark shape emerged from the trees. In the split second before I slammed the car into reverse, I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes and wickedly curved claws. We tore out of the campground, gravel spraying as I fishtailed onto the main road. I didn't slow down until we had put several miles between us and Whispering Pines. As we sped through the night, Sarah turned to me, her face pale and streaked with tears. What was that thing?" I shook my head, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it." We drove straight to the nearest police station, where we spent the next several hours giving statements and answering questions. The officers looked skeptical as we recounted our story, exchanging glances that clearly said they thought we were either crazy or pulling some kind of prank. They sent out a search party at first light, but found nothing. No sign of the young couple, no blood, not even the shredded tent I had described. The campsite looked completely normal, as if nothing had ever happened there. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah and I struggled to come to terms with what we had experienced. We scoured local news reports, hoping to find some mention of the missing couple, but there was nothing. It was as if they had never existed. We tried to move on with our lives, but the memory of that night haunted us. Every unexplained noise, every shadow in the corner of our eye, brought us right back to that terrifying moment in the woods. About a month after the incident, I received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single photograph, grainy and slightly out of focus. It showed a large, dark figure moving between trees, its shape vaguely humanoid but somehow wrong. On the back of the photo, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "You're not crazy, we've seen it too." I never found out who sent the photo or how they knew about our experience, but in a strange way it brought me comfort. It was proof that we weren't alone, that others had encountered whatever was out there in the woods. Sarah and I haven't been camping since that night. The thought of sleeping in a tent, vulnerable to whatever might be lurking in the darkness, is more than we can bear. But we haven't given up on finding answers. We've connected with others online who have had similar experiences, sharing stories and theories about what might be hiding in the wild places of the world. Some talk about cryptids, others about interdimensional beings or government experiments gone wrong. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that there are things out there, things that defy explanation and challenge everything we think we understand about the world, and sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside our window, I find myself wondering about that young couple. Did they survive? Are they out there somewhere trying to make sense of what happened to them, just like us? Or did they become just another mystery of the forest, another story whispered around campfires, a warning to those who venture too deep into the unknown? I may never know the full truth of what happened that night at Whispering Pines campground, but one thing's for certain. I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Because now I know that in the darkest corners of the forest, in the shadows between the trees, there are things that wait and watch, things that remind us that we are not alone in this world, and that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 5. They say the forest has a way of swallowing things whole, people, time, even sound. I always thought that was a figure of speech until the day I got the call. It was supposed to be just another routine check-in, a hiker gone off trail, reported by a panicked spouse. But what started as an ordinary search turned into something far more sinister, something that still haunts me every time I step into the woods. The radio crackled to life that afternoon, interrupting the dull hum of paperwork in the ranger station. "Dispatch to Ranger Matt. You copy?" came the voice of Lisa, the dispatcher. She didn't sound particularly alarmed, but there was something off in her tone. I grabbed the handheld radio off my desk and pressed the button. "Ranger Matt here. Go ahead. We've got a missing person report up near Bear Creek. Hiker named Daniel Perry, 42 years old. His wife says he went out alone this morning and hasn't come back yet. You available to check it out?" I glanced at the clock. It was mid-afternoon, plenty of daylight left. I could get up there and back before dark if I hustled. "On my way. Any details on his last known location?" He was supposed to stay on Trail 6, but his wife said he liked to wander off trail now and then. She mentioned hearing some kind of strange sounds on his last call before he cut out. I felt a small knot form in my stomach. Strange sounds. Yeah, she said he was hearing footsteps, like something was following him. But no one else was around. She thought it was an animal, might be nothing, but you know how these things go. I knew exactly how they went. Missing hikers could turn up anywhere, and half the time they were just lost or disoriented. But the idea of footsteps trailing him out in the woods was enough to make my instincts prick up. "I'll head up there now," I replied, already grabbing my gear. The drive to Bear Creek took about 45 minutes, but it felt longer. The further I got from the station, the denser the forest became. Towering pines loomed overhead, their shadows stretching across the narrow road. By the time I parked at the trailhead, the late afternoon sun was casting an eerie, golden glow over everything. I grabbed my radio and a small pack, then started down Trail 6, moving quickly but carefully. The first mile or so was uneventful, just the usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. But as I went deeper, the woods began to change. The sounds faded, one by one, until all I could hear was the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That uneasy feeling from earlier grew stronger, but I kept moving. I told myself it was just the quiet before dusk, just the forest settling down for the night. About 2 miles in, I found something. Daniel's backpack. It was half buried under some leaves, as if it had been tossed aside in a hurry. I crouched down to inspect it, unzipping the main compartment. Inside, I found a map, a half-empty water bottle, and a radio, his lifeline completely dead. That knot in my stomach tightened. I pulled out my own radio and pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Matt. I found the hiker's backpack about 2 miles in. No sign of him yet." "Copy that." Lisa's voice crackled back. "Any tracks or signs of where he might have gone?" I glanced around, scanning the ground. There were some faint footprints leading off the trail, deeper into the woods, but they were scattered, like he had been moving erratically. "Looks like he might have gone off trail. I'm going to follow the tracks. Be careful out there, Matt. Sun's going down soon." I looked up at the sky. The light was already beginning to fade, casting long shadows through the trees. "I'll check it out and head back before dark," I promised. I followed Daniel's tracks off the trail, my flashlight ready in case the daylight gave out sooner than expected. The deeper I went, the harder it became to make out his footprints. The forest floor was uneven, covered in thick patches of moss and underbrush. But every few yards, I'd spot another print, slightly smudged, but still there. And then, after what felt like an eternity of walking, I heard it, a faint crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze, straining to listen. For a moment, the forest was deathly silent again. Then, another snap, closer this time. "Daniel," I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. "This is Ranger Matt. If you can hear me, say something." No response, just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the trees with my flashlight. The beam sliced through the growing darkness, illuminating patches of bark and undergrowth, but nothing else. And then I heard it again, those footsteps. But this time, they didn't sound like they were coming from in front of me. They were behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding, shining the light in every direction. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whatever or whoever was following me had frozen in place. My flashlight flicked over the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone, just trees, and that suffocating silence. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. This wasn't right. Even the wildlife had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing, just me and whatever was out there. I swallowed hard and pressed the radio button again. "Dispatch, I'm hearing something out here. Footsteps. I don't see anyone, but it's close." "Matt, you need to come back." Lisa's voice came through, sharper this time. "If there's an animal or someone out there, it's getting dark fast. You don't want to be stuck out there in the pitch black." I hesitated, glancing back at the faint tracks in the dirt. Daniel was still out here, but that feeling in my gut, the one that told me something was wrong, was screaming at me to leave. "Copy that," I said, turning back toward the trail. "I'm heading back." But as I retraced my steps, the footsteps started again. This time, they were louder, closer, and they didn't stop when I did. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. The footsteps followed. No matter how fast I walked, they matched me. Step for step, always just out of sight, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I was practically running by the time I hit the trail again, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were right behind me now, so close I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. But when I looked over my shoulder, nothing. Panic set in. I bolted down the trail, branches whipping at my face, the fading light barely enough to guide me. The footsteps grew fainter, but they never completely disappeared. It was like something was toying with me, keeping just out of sight. By the time I reached the truck, I was drenched in sweat, my chest heaving as I fumbled with the door handle. I scrambled inside, slammed the door, and locked it, my hands shaking. For a moment, I just sat there, staring out into the dark forest. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was back, thick and heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. I grabbed the radio, my voice shaky. "Dispatch, I'm back at the truck. No sign of Daniel, but something's out here. I don't know what, but it's not right." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Lisa's voice came through, softer now. "Head back to the station, Matt. We'll send a team out first thing in the morning." I didn't argue. I started the engine and peeled out of there, the headlights barely cutting through the thickening darkness. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me down the road. But there was nothing, just the empty forest, stretching out behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching me, waiting for me to leave. And as much as I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, the sound of those footsteps was still fresh in my mind. The search team went out the next morning. They combed the area for days, but they never found Daniel. No body, no sign of struggle, just his backpack and the faint and scattered footprints leading into the woods. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but even now, every time I go back to Bear Creek, I can feel it. The weight of those footsteps, always just behind me, always keeping pace, waiting for me to look back. But I never do. Story 6. The moment I saw those photos, I knew my life would never be the same. What started as a routine check of my trail cameras turned into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. I've spent my entire career as a wildlife photographer, but nothing could have prepared me for what I captured on film that day in the depths of the Olympic National Forest. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out to retrieve the memory cards from my hidden cameras. I'd placed them strategically throughout a remote area of the forest, hoping to capture some rare footage of the local wildlife. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I made my way along the overgrown trail, my boots crunching on fallen leaves. I'd been doing this for years, and the routine was comforting. Check the first camera, swap out the memory card, move on to the next. But as I approached the location of my third camera, something felt off. The forest seemed unusually quiet. The typical chattering of birds and rustling of small animals noticeably absent. As I pushed through a thick patch of ferns, I froze. The tree where I'd mounted my camera was right in front of me, but the device was gone. In its place was a mangled mess of plastic and wires, hanging limply from the trunk. My heart raced as I approached the destroyed camera. What could have done this? Bears were common in the area, but they usually just batted the cameras around a bit. This looked like it had been deliberately torn apart. With shaking hands, I examined the remains of the camera. The casing was cracked and twisted, the lens shattered. But miraculously, the memory card was still intact, lodged in a crevice of the warped plastic. I pocketed the card, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just vandals, I told myself. Some hikers with too much time on their hands. But deep down, I knew this was something different. I hurried back to my campsite, eager to check the footage on my laptop. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I finally sat down to review what the camera had captured. The first few hours of footage were normal. A deer grazing, a raccoon scurrying by, the usual forest scenes. But then, at around 2 a.m., something large moved in front of the camera. I leaned in closer, squinting at the screen. The image was dark and grainy, but I could make out a massive, fur-covered shape. It moved with an odd gait, almost like a man, but not quite. As it turned towards the camera, two eyes reflected the infrared light, glowing eerily in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. This was no bear, no known animal I'd ever encountered in all my years in the wilderness. The creature reached out towards the camera with what looked like a hand, a massive, clawed hand, and then the footage cut out. I sat back, my mind reeling. What had I just seen? It couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax, a man in a costume, something explainable. But the way it moved, the sheer size of it, a cold fear crept up my spine as I realized I might have captured something truly extraordinary or truly terrifying. I spent the rest of the evening poring over the footage, analyzing every frame. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that this was no hoax. The musculature, the way the fur lay on its body, the fluid yet inhuman movement, it all pointed to something beyond our current understanding of wildlife. As night fell, the forest around my campsite seemed to come alive with sounds. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. What if it was still out there? What if it knew I had seen it? I barely slept that night, my dreams filled with glowing eyes and reaching claws. When dawn finally broke, I made a decision. I had to go back. I had to see if I could find any physical evidence of the creature's presence. With my camera in hand and a heavy dose of trepidation in my heart, I made my way back to the site of the destroyed camera. In the light of day, the forest seemed less threatening, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I approached the tree, I noticed something I had missed in my initial shock the day before. There, in the soft earth around the base of the tree, was a footprint. My breath caught as I crouched down to examine it. The print was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot. It was vaguely human-shaped, but the toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks. I fumbled for my camera, my hands shaking as I snapped picture after picture of the print. As I photographed the footprint, I noticed something else. Caught on a nearby branch was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. I carefully removed it, placing it in a small plastic bag I had in my pack. This was evidence. Real, tangible evidence. My mind was racing as I made my way back to the campsite. What should I do with this information? Going to the authorities seemed like the obvious choice. But would they believe me? And if they did, what would happen to this creature if its existence was revealed to the world? I spent the next few days in a daze, alternating between examining my evidence and jumping at every sound from the forest around me. I knew I should pack up and leave, report my findings to someone. But a part of me couldn't bear to go. Not yet. Not without trying to see it again. So I stayed. I set up new cameras, this time with sturdier casings and better night vision capabilities. I spent my days scouring the forest for more signs of the creature, and my nights huddled in my tent, listening to the sounds of the wilderness with new ears. A week passed with no further sightings. I was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, I had imagined the whole thing. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath me. I scrambled out of my tent, camera in hand, heart pounding. The sound had come from the direction of a small clearing about 100 yards from my campsite. I moved towards it as quietly as I could, every sense on high alert. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw it. The creature was standing with its back to me, massive and hulking, its fur silvery in the moonlight. It was easily 8 feet tall, with shoulders twice as broad as a man's. I raised my camera with trembling hands, hardly daring to breathe. Just as I was about to press the shutter, it turned, our eyes met, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still. Its eyes were deep-set and intelligent, full of an awareness that shook me to my core. This was no animal, at least not in the way we usually think of them. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that spoke of a history and a knowledge far beyond our own. For a heartbeat, we stared at each other, human and inhuman, both frozen in disbelief. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the creature turned and vanished into the forest, leaving nothing but a rush of wind and the lingering sense of an encounter with the unknown. I stood there for what felt like hours, my camera hanging forgotten at my side. I had seen it, really seen it, and it had seen me. The next morning, I packed up my campsite with shaking hands. As much as a part of me wanted to stay, to try and encounter the creature again, I knew it was time to go. This discovery was too big, too important to keep to myself. But as I drove away from the Olympic National Forest, my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Who could I tell about this that would believe me? And more importantly, should I tell anyone at all? The creature I had seen was something beyond our current understanding, something that had managed to remain hidden from human eyes for who knows how long. Did I have the right to expose its existence to the world? Would doing so put it in danger? In the end, I decided to keep my discovery to myself, at least for the time being. I hid away the footage, the photographs, the hair sample, but I couldn't forget what I had seen. The memory of those intelligent eyes meeting mine haunted my dreams. I've returned to the Olympic National Forest many times since then, always hoping for another glimpse of the creature. I've never seen it again, but sometimes, when the wind is right and the forest is quiet, I can almost sense its presence. A reminder that there are still mysteries in this world, things that defy explanation and challenge our understanding of reality. And sometimes, late at night when the world is asleep, I find myself wondering, if I found this creature, this being that seems to exist on the fringes of our world, what else might be out there? What other secrets does the wilderness hold? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at a dark forest the same way again, because now I know that sometimes, when you stare into the shadows, something might just stare back. Story 7. There's something about the woods at night that strips away your sense of safety, no matter how many times you've been camping. I've always considered myself a pretty rational guy. I don't scare easily, and I love being outdoors, especially in the quiet, remote parts of the forest. But this trip, this one night, changed all that for me. It's the night I learned that sometimes the darkness holds more than just shadows. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip with a couple of old friends, Brian, Luke, and me. We picked a spot deep in the national forest, far away from the usual campgrounds and any other human activity. We wanted solitude, peace, and the kind of quiet you can only get when the nearest town is miles away. The day had been perfect. We hiked, set up camp near a small stream, and sat around the fire as the sun dipped below the horizon, talking about nothing in particular, just enjoying the stillness. But when night fully set in, that peaceful quiet turned into something else, something more oppressive, more aware. It was sometime around 11 p.m. The fire had burned down to embers, and the three of us sat around it in silence, staring into the glowing coals. The conversation had died down, and I remember feeling a little restless, maybe because of the complete lack of sound. No birds, no insects. Nothing, just the faint crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of a log. I didn't think much of it at the time, but in hindsight, that was the first sign that something was off. We were sitting there, just the three of us, when I noticed them, eyes, reflecting the firelight from the trees. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, curious about our camp, but these eyes were higher up, far too high to belong to anything like that. They were level with my head, and I was sitting on a camping chair. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. "Hey, do you guys see that?" I asked, my voice low, as if speaking too loudly might provoke whatever it was. Brian and Luke both turned their heads in the direction I was pointing. Luke squinted. "What?" "Those eyes," I said, feeling my pulse quicken. "Right there, between those trees." For a second, neither of them responded, and I wondered if maybe it was just a trick of the light, a reflection off something, until Brian stood up. "Yeah, I see them," he said, his voice tinged with unease. "What the hell is that? We all stared at the pair of eyes, unblinking and still, just watching us from the darkness. I couldn't tell how far away they were, maybe 50 feet, maybe less. But they were too high off the ground, too focused, to belong to anything I could explain away. Luke stood up now, too. He grabbed his flashlight from his backpack and flicked it on, shining the beam into the trees where the eyes were, but as soon as the light hit them, they disappeared, just like that. Gone. "Did you see it?" Luke asked, waving the flashlight back and forth. There was something there, right? Brian was already reaching for his own flashlight. "Yeah, I saw it. It was just standing there." I didn't move. My stomach had clenched, and my brain was trying to come up with some reasonable explanation. An animal, maybe a trick of the light, something that didn't involve us being watched by something we couldn't see. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't something natural. "I think we should call it a night," I said, my voice tight. "Just get some sleep and head out early tomorrow." Brian and Luke agreed, though we all moved a little quicker than usual, packing up the campfire, zipping up our tents. There was a nervous energy between us that none of us wanted to talk about. We were trying to act like nothing had happened, but I could see the tension in their faces, the way their eyes kept flicking toward the trees. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, the thin nylon fabric suddenly feeling a lot less secure than it had earlier. I lay down on my sleeping bag, listening. The silence outside was deafening. I strained my ears for any sound, footsteps, rustling, anything to tell me where those eyes had gone. Nothing, just that oppressive, suffocating silence. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a noise, a faint sound like breathing. For a second I lay there, frozen in place, unsure if I'd really heard it or if it had just been part of a dream. But then it came again, soft, steady, but close, too close. I turned my head toward the tent flap, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound was coming from right outside. Someone, or something, was standing just outside my tent. My throat tightened. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. I just lay there, listening to that slow, rhythmic breathing, feeling my heart pound in my chest. I told myself it was just one of the guys, maybe Brian or Luke, walking around, but I knew that wasn't right. I knew the sound wasn't coming from them. It was too deliberate, too steady, like whatever was out there knew I was inside, and it was waiting for me to make a move. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one dragging on longer than the last. My mind raced with questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Should I unzip the tent and look? Should I stay silent and hope it went away? I didn't have to decide, though, because suddenly the breathing stopped, just cut off, like a switch had been flipped. I lay there in the silence, my body stiff with fear, waiting to see what would happen next. Then came the footsteps. Soft at first, just the faint crunch of leaves underfoot, but they were deliberate, heavy, moving slowly around the perimeter of the tent. I could hear them circling, getting closer, then farther away, then closer again, like whatever was out there was pacing, deciding what to do next. I thought about calling out to Brian or Luke, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of making noise, of alerting whatever it was that I was awake. Maybe it was the nagging thought that even if I yelled, they might not be able to help. The footsteps stopped again, this time on the side of the tent closest to my head. I stared at the thin fabric, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as they had stopped, the footsteps moved again, this time walking away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, eyes wide open, ears straining to catch any sound. But there was nothing else, just the same oppressive silence that had settled over the forest hours ago. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I finally unzipped my tent and stepped outside. Brian and Luke were already up, both looking as haggard and uneasy as I felt. "Did you hear that last night?" Brian asked, his voice low as if saying it out loud might somehow make it worse. I nodded. "The footsteps." Luke rubbed his face, looking pale. "Yeah, I heard them too. It circled my tent. I didn't know what to do, so I just stayed quiet. We didn't need to say anything else. We all knew we had to leave. None of us wanted to stick around long enough to find out what had been watching us. We packed up camp in record time, barely speaking as we stuffed sleeping bags and tents into our backpacks. As we were finishing, I glanced toward the spot in the trees where I had seen those eyes the night before, and there they were again, watching. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Brian and Luke noticed the change in my posture and followed my gaze. They saw it too, the eyes, still and unblinking, staring at us from the edge of the forest. None of us said a word. We grabbed our gear and walked out of there, moving faster than I thought possible without actually breaking into a run. The whole way back to the trailhead, I felt those eyes on me, the weight of their gaze pressing down on my back. We never talked about it again. Not really, sure. We made jokes about weird animals in the forest, but deep down, we all knew it wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something that didn't want us there, and it was still out there watching, waiting for the next campers to come too close. Story 8. I never thought I'd be afraid of the dark again. Not since I was a kid, but that night in the Appalachian wilderness changed everything. What started as a simple hiking trip turned into a fight for survival against something we couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't escape. My best friend Jake and I had been planning this trip for months. We were both experienced hikers, having tackled some of the toughest trails in the country. But the remote section of the Appalachian Trail we chose for this adventure was new territory for us. We were looking for a challenge, something to test our skills and endurance. We got more than we bargained for. The first 2 days of our hike were everything we'd hoped for. The autumn air was crisp and invigorating, the foliage a breathtaking array of reds and golds. We made good time, covering more ground than we'd anticipated. As the sun began to set on the third day, we decided to push on a bit further before making camp, hoping to reach a scenic overlook we'd read about in our trail guide. That's when things started to go wrong. The trail became less distinct as we continued, overgrown in places and hard to follow in the fading light. We should have stopped and made camp right then, but our stubborn determination pushed us forward. It wasn't long before we had to admit the truth. We were lost. "We should have turned back an hour ago," Jake said, frustration evident in his voice as he consulted our map for the 100th time. I nodded, trying to keep my own anxiety in check. "Let's just find a clearing and set up camp. We can figure out where we are in the morning." We pushed through the undergrowth, our headlamps casting eerie shadows among the trees. That's when we heard it for the first time, a sound that made us both freeze in our tracks. It was a footstep, a heavy, deliberate footstep that seemed to come from somewhere behind us. We turned, our lights sweeping the darkness, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. "Probably just a deer," Jake said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We continued on, moving faster now, both of us on high alert. The sound came again, closer this time, and then again. It was unmistakable now. Something was following us. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared in the vast darkness of the forest. "Is someone there?" No response. Just another heavy footstep, and another, getting closer. We broke into a run, panic overriding all other thoughts. Branches whipped at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush, our packs bouncing awkwardly on our backs. The footsteps behind us quickened too, keeping pace. Suddenly, Jake's foot caught on a root and he went down hard. I skidded to a stop, reaching down to help him up. As I did, I swept my headlamp back the way we'd come. For just a split second, I saw something. A shape, massive and dark, moving between the trees. It was gone so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it, but the prickling fear at the back of my neck told me it was real. "We need to find shelter," I gasped, pulling Jake to his feet. "Now!" We stumbled on, our flight now fueled by sheer terror. The footsteps behind us never faltered, never slowed. Whatever was chasing us had the stamina of a machine. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, we burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. In the center stood an old fire tower, its metal frame silhouetted against the night sky. "There!" Jake wheezed, pointing at the tower. Without a word, we sprinted for it. The ladder was old and rusty, but we climbed it like our lives depended on it, which, for all we knew, they did. We didn't stop until we reached the small room at the top, slamming the trapdoor shut behind us. For a few minutes, we just sat there, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding so hard I thought they might burst from our chests. The metal room creaked and swayed slightly in the wind, but it felt like the safest place in the world right then. What was that thing? Jake finally managed to say. I shook my head, still trying to process what I'd seen. I don't know, but it was big, really big. We fell silent again, straining our ears for any sound from below. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, just as we started to relax, we heard it. The unmistakable sound of something large moving around the base of the tower. We held our breath, hardly daring to move. The thing circled the tower once, twice, 3 times. Then, to our horror, we heard a new sound, the creak of metal under strain. It's climbing, Jake whispered, his face pale in the dim light of our headlamps. I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a movement caught my eye. Something was indeed climbing the tower, moving with an unnatural speed and agility for its size. We need to do something, I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. We're trapped up here. Jake was rummaging through his pack. I've got an idea, he said, pulling out the small canister of bear spray he always carried. When that thing reaches the top, we blast it with this and make a run for it. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. We positioned ourselves on either side of the trap door, Jake with the bear spray, me with my hiking pole gripped like a weapon. The creaking of the metal grew louder as the creature neared the top. We could hear its heavy breathing now, ragged and animalistic. My hands were sweating so much I could barely keep hold of the hiking pole. Just as the trapdoor began to move, Jake yelled, "Now!" and unleashed a stream of bear spray. The effect was immediate. A terrible, inhuman roar shook the tower, followed by the sound of something large falling. We didn't wait to see what happened next. We flung open the trapdoor and practically flew down the ladder. We hit the ground running and didn't stop. The roars behind us gradually faded, replaced by the sound of our own labored breathing and pounding footsteps. We ran until our legs gave out, collapsing in a small gully as the first light of dawn began to color the sky. For a long time, we just lay there, too exhausted and terrified to move. As the sun rose, casting long shadows through the trees, we finally began to feel safe enough to take stock of our situation. We were lost, our packs left behind in the fire tower, with no food, water, or supplies. But we were alive, which seemed like a miracle given what we'd just been through. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. I stood up on shaky legs, looking around. "We need to find our way back to the trail. Get to a ranger station or something. Report what happened." Jake nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Who's going to believe us? We don't have any proof." He was right, of course. It sounded crazy even to me, and I'd lived through it. Who would believe a story about being chased through the woods by some unknown creature? It took us most of the day to find our way back to a marked trail. We were dehydrated, exhausted, and jumpy at every sound, but we finally made it to a ranger station just as night was falling again. The rangers were skeptical of our story, to say the least. They put it down to dehydration and exhaustion playing tricks on our minds, but they did send out a search party to retrieve our abandoned gear from the fire tower. When the search party returned, they had our packs and something else. Caught on the metal frame of the tower, they'd found tufts of coarse, dark hair, unlike anything they'd seen before, and on the ground around the base of the tower were footprints, huge footprints, with claw marks at the ends of the toes. Suddenly, people started taking our story a lot more seriously. In the weeks and months that followed, there were investigations, interviews with cryptozoologists, even a short-lived media frenzy. But no concrete answers ever emerged. The hair samples were inconclusive, the footprints dismissed as elaborate hoaxes by some. Jake and I know the truth, though. We know what we saw, what chased us through the darkness that night, and we know that there are things out there in the deep woods and wild places of the world that defy explanation. I still hike, still love the outdoors. But I never go into the backcountry anymore without remembering that night, without scanning the shadows, listening for heavy footsteps following in the darkness, because now I know, sometimes, when you venture into the wilderness, you're not at the top of the food chain anymore, and sometimes the monsters from our childhood nightmares turn out to be all too real. Story 9, there's a strange feeling that settles over you when you know you're not alone, when every instinct, every fiber in your body is screaming that something is watching you. It's like an invisible weight presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. And in the forest, miles away from civilization, that feeling becomes something far more terrifying. It started as just another solo hike, something I did whenever I needed to clear my head. There's nothing like the solitude of the woods to help you reset. No distractions, no noise, just you and nature. I'd hiked these trails countless times before, narrow paths winding through dense trees, the occasional sound of a bird or the rustling of a small animal in the underbrush. But this time, something was different. The air was still, too still. The kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle, that turns the peaceful quiet into something unnerving. I shrugged it off at first, convincing myself it was nothing. The weather had been strange lately, and maybe the animals were just hunkering down. But as I walked deeper into the forest, that uneasy feeling followed me like a shadow. I wasn't far from my usual turnaround point, a small clearing with a rock outcrop where I'd sit and have a snack before heading back. That's when I first heard it. Footsteps, not mine, not an animal. These were slow, deliberate, and matched my own steps, always a beat behind, just far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. I stopped in my tracks, heart thudding in my chest, and listened. Nothing. The forest had fallen back into that eerie silence. Not even a hint of wind in the trees. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks on me. After all, I hadn't seen another person all day, and this trail wasn't exactly popular. I took a deep breath, shook it off, and started walking again. But the moment I did, the footsteps resumed. This time, I stopped quickly, spinning around in one smooth motion. The trees stood tall and silent, their thick trunks casting long shadows in the fading afternoon light. There was no one. No sign of movement, no crunch of leaves underfoot, just stillness. I swallowed hard, feeling the first real surge of fear creep up my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. It was stupid, I know, but I had to say something. The silence that followed was suffocating. No answer. I stood there for a moment longer, scanning the woods for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, just that damn silence. My heart was still racing, but I forced myself to move. If it was some animal following me, it would have taken off by now. And if it was a person, well, I didn't want to think about that. I kept walking, faster this time, pushing toward the clearing where I always stopped for a break. The footsteps didn't follow me at first. I allowed myself a moment of relief, thinking maybe it was all in my head, but just as I reached the edge of the clearing, they started again, slow, steady, and right behind me. I whipped around again, this time pulling out my small pocket knife, a flimsy thing that I knew wouldn't do much against anything bigger than a squirrel. But it made me feel better to have something in my hand, something that made me feel a little less vulnerable. "Who's there?" I called out, louder now. My voice echoed off the trees, but still, no answer, no movement, just the oppressive silence that had settled over the forest like a thick fog. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting between the trees, scanning for any sign of movement. The light was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the ground, and every dark patch between the trees seemed to shift and move in the corner of my eye. My grip tightened on the knife, my heart pounding in my ears. Nothing moved, but I knew something was there. I wasn't about to stick around and wait to find out what it was. My nerves were shot, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts as I turned back toward the clearing and started to jog. The clearing was just ahead, and once I was out in the open, I could get my bearings, maybe convince myself I was just being paranoid. But as soon as I moved, the footsteps followed, faster this time, matching my pace. They weren't just behind me anymore. They were close, too close. I sprinted the last few yards into the clearing, my lungs burning, my pulse racing. When I reached the open space, I stopped, gasping for air, and spun around, knife raised, ready to defend myself from whatever it was. But the footsteps had stopped. There was nothing, no movement, no sound, no sign that anyone or anything had been following me at all. I stood there, heart pounding, eyes wide, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The light was fading fast now, casting the forest in deep shadows. The clearing felt open, exposed, like I was standing in the middle of a stage with no audience. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe the echo of my own footsteps had bounced off the trees in some strange way. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I knew something, or someone, had been following me. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself down. I could still make it back to the trailhead before dark if I moved fast. I didn't want to be out here when the sun fully set. Whatever had been out there was quiet now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching. I turned back toward the trail, ready to head back, when I saw them. Eyes, two glowing orbs, reflecting the fading light just inside the tree line, watching me. They were too high off the ground to be a deer, too still to be any animal I'd ever encountered. My heart stopped, and for a moment I couldn't move. Those eyes were locked on me, unblinking, unmoving. I stumbled back, tripping over a rock, barely catching myself before I hit the ground. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just watched. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't. I was frozen, staring into those eyes, unable to look away. They were too human, too focused, like they were studying me, waiting for something. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, before I finally snapped out of it. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, and I turned and ran. I sprinted down the trail, not caring about the branches that whipped against my face, not caring about the rocks that tripped me up. I just ran. The footsteps followed. They were louder now, faster, right behind me, matching my every step. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see whatever was behind me, didn't want to know how close it was. My only thought was getting back to the trailhead, getting out of the forest before whatever it was caught up to me. I don't know how I made it. By the time I saw the parking lot through the trees, my legs felt like lead, my chest burning with every breath. But I didn't stop. I ran straight for my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, I just sat there, staring out at the darkening forest, expecting to see those eyes at the edge of the trees, watching me. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent woods. I didn't waste any time. I started the engine and peeled out of there, my heart still racing, my mind spinning with questions I didn't want to answer. I didn't look back once. I couldn't. I didn't want to see if those eyes were still following me. I haven't been back to that trail since. I don't know what was out there, watching me, following me. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe it was something I'll never understand. All I know is that whatever it wasn't human, and it's still out there. Story 10. The moment I saw that mutilated deer carcass, I knew something was terribly wrong in these woods. I've been a hunter for over 2 decades, but nothing in my experience could explain the savage destruction before me. Little did I know, This grisly discovery would plunge me into a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on what I thought would be a routine hunting trip. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell I've always associated with the peace and solitude of the woods. I'd been tracking a big buck for the better part of the morning, following a trail of broken twigs and fresh droppings. The trail led me deeper into the forest than I'd usually go, to an area I wasn't as familiar with. That's when I smelled it, the unmistakable stench of death and decay. Following my nose, I pushed through a dense thicket and stumbled into a small clearing. What I saw there stopped me dead in my tracks. In the center of the clearing lay the remains of a large deer, but remains is hardly the right word for the carnage before me. The deer had been torn apart, its body rent in ways that defied explanation. This wasn't the work of a bear or a mountain lion. I've seen plenty of kills from both, and this was something entirely different. The carcass was splayed open, ribcage shattered as if it had exploded from the inside out. Chunks of flesh were strewn about the clearing, some hanging from low branches as if they'd been flung there with tremendous force. But it was the bite marks that really got to me. They were huge, far larger than any predator I knew of in these parts, and the pattern was all wrong. Not the neat, efficient killing bite of a natural predator, but savage, almost frenzied marks that spoke of a kind of violence I'd never encountered before. I approached cautiously, my rifle held ready. The kill was fresh, couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Whatever had done this could still be nearby. As I examined the carcass more closely, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth around the kill site, were footprints, but not animal tracks like I was expecting. These were bipedal prints, vaguely human-shaped but massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, and at the end of each toe was a deep gouge in the earth, as if the creature had claws. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There had to be a logical explanation, right? Maybe it was some kind of elaborate hoax, or maybe I was misinterpreting the evidence in front of me. But deep down, I knew. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist. I took out my phone and started snapping pictures, documenting everything I could see, the carcass, the strange footprints, even the bits of fur and flesh scattered around the clearing. If I was going to report this, and I knew I had to, I wanted as much evidence as possible. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, rifle at the ready, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The woods had gone eerily silent. No birds, no insects, nothing but that menacing growl. For a moment, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, something large and dark slipping between the trees, but it was gone so fast, I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for stealth or direction. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, had to get back to my truck and civilization. It wasn't until I burst out onto the logging road where I'd parked that I finally slowed down. I was gasping for breath, my legs shaking from the adrenaline and exertion. As I drove home, my mind kept replaying what I'd seen, trying to make sense of it all. I spent that night poring over the photos I'd taken, zooming in on details, searching for anything that might explain what I'd encountered. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that this was something beyond ordinary explanation. The next morning, I went to the local ranger station to report what I'd found. The ranger on duty, a grizzled old-timer named Bob, listened to my story with a skeptical expression, but when I showed him the photos, his demeanor changed. "I've been working these woods for 30 years, he said, his voice low and serious, "and I've never seen anything like this. But," he hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening, "you're not the first to report something strange in that area." He told me about other sightings, hikers who'd heard unexplained noises in the night, campers who'd woken to find their sights ransacked by something far too strong to be a normal animal. There were even a few reports of giant humanoid footprints, just like the ones I'd seen. "We've kept it quiet," Bob explained. "Didn't want to start a panic or attract a bunch of thrill-seekers. But if what you're saying is true, if there's really something out there doing this," he gestured at the photos of the mutilated deer, "then we need to investigate." Over the next few weeks, I joined Bob and a small team of wildlife experts on several expeditions into the area where I'd made my discovery. We found more evidence, more unexplained footprints, trees that had been marked with claw marks far too high for any known animal, even a few more mutilated carcasses, but we never saw the creature itself. It was as if it knew we were looking for it, always staying one step ahead of us. We set up trail cameras, but they either captured nothing or were found smashed to pieces. As our investigation continued, word started to get out. Local news picked up the story, and soon we had cryptozoologists and monster hunters flocking to the area. The woods I'd once known as a place of peace and solitude became a circus of competing theories and amateur investigations. Some said it was a previously undiscovered species, some kind of primitive human ancestor that had somehow survived to the present day. Others insisted it was something more supernatural, a skinwalker from Native American lore, or even an interdimensional being. For my part, I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was what I'd seen with my own eyes and the undeniable evidence we'd gathered. Whatever this thing was, it was real, and it was dangerous. As the months passed and winter set in, the sightings and evidence became less frequent. Some suggested the creature had migrated or gone into hibernation. Others thought the increased human activity had driven it deeper into the wilderness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching and waiting. Every time I went into the woods now, whether for hunting or just a hike, I found myself constantly on edge, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, straining my ears for that low, menacing growl. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I've always considered myself a rational person, someone who believed in what I could see and touch. But now I find myself questioning everything, wondering what other secrets the world might be hiding. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods, but it's different now. The forest that once felt like a second home now feels alien, full of shadows and hidden dangers. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sends a jolt of adrenaline through my system. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the forest is quiet, I swear I can hear it, that low, rumbling growl that haunts my dreams. A reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of what we know and understand. I don't know if we'll ever find concrete proof of what's out there, if we'll ever capture or confront the creature that's turned our quiet corner of the world upside down. Part of me hopes we do, if only to validate what I know I saw, to prove to the world that I'm not crazy. But another part of me, a part that grows stronger with each passing day, hopes we never do, because some mysteries, once solved, can never be undone. And I fear that if we ever do come face to face with the thing that lurks in our woods, we may find ourselves confronting a reality we're not prepared to accept. So I keep watching the woods, keep listening for that growl, and I wonder, not for the first time, if there are some secrets that are better left undiscovered. Story 11. There are things you think you're prepared for when you spend years in the woods. Dangerous animals, sudden storms, even the occasional encounter with a poacher or a lost hiker. But nothing prepares you for the moment when the forest itself seems to turn on you. That's what happened the night those hunters disappeared. To this day, I still can't explain it, and maybe I don't want to. All I know is that it changed the way I see the wilderness forever. I was the senior ranger on duty when the call came in. The sun had just set, and I was getting ready to settle in for a quiet night shift at the station. It had been a long day, but nothing out of the ordinary. A few lost campers found their way back to the trailhead. A minor injury from someone who tripped over a root. the usual stuff. The forest felt calm, the way it usually did once dusk rolled in. But that calm was shattered when the phone rang. "Ranger Station, this is Matt," I answered, leaning back in my chair. The voice on the other end was frantic, breathless. "You gotta help me, please. I don't know what's out here, but they're gone. They're all gone." I straightened up, heart already starting to race. "Slow down. Where are you?" "Bear Ridge, out past the old logging road. We were hunting. There was something big. It wasn't normal. We chased it. But now the others are gone. Please, you have to come get me." His voice cracked with panic, and it sent a cold chill through me. Bear Ridge was about 10 miles from the station, a remote part of the forest, usually only visited by hunters or experienced hikers. I'd been out there dozens of times, but I'd never heard anyone talk about something like this. "What do you mean, they're gone?" I asked, grabbing my flashlight and heading toward the truck. "Did you get separated?" "I don't know. One minute they were there, the next, I don't know." There was this noise, like something big moving through the trees. "I can't see anything, it's so dark. Please, just hurry." I told him to stay where he was, and that I'd be there as fast as I could. As I sped down the narrow dirt road toward Bear Ridge, my mind raced through possible explanations. It was probably just an animal, a bear maybe, or a deer that startled them. But the tone in his voice, that raw fear, gnawed at me. When I finally reached the turnoff for the old logging road, I killed the engine and stepped out into the night. The forest was pitch black, the only sounds the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I grabbed my gear, a flashlight, a radio, and a first aid kit, and started down the narrow path toward Bear Ridge. My boots crunched softly on the dirt, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. As I hiked, I kept an ear out for any signs of movement. The forest was unusually quiet, though. No owls, no insects, not even the usual creaks and groans of the trees settling in for the night. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. About halfway up the ridge, I found the first sign that something was wrong. A rifle. It was lying in the dirt, abandoned, as if someone had just dropped it mid-step. I knelt down and picked it up, shining my flashlight around. The ground was disturbed, like there had been a struggle, or maybe just someone moving quickly. There were footprints, deep and erratic, leading farther up the ridge. I radioed back to the station, telling them what I'd found and that I was continuing the search. My gut was telling me that something was very wrong, but I didn't have much of a choice. Whoever was up there was counting on me to find them. I pressed on, the silence around me becoming more unnerving with every step. The trail narrowed as I climbed higher, the trees closing in, their branches forming a tangled canopy overhead. I could barely see the sky now, just the faint outline of stars through the gaps in the leaves, and then I heard it, a low, deep growl, reverberating through the trees. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My flashlight swept the area, but I couldn't see anything. The growl came again, closer this time, and I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before, not a bear, not a wolf. It was different. I gripped the rifle tighter and slowly moved forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. The growl had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. That's when I saw the second sign that something was horribly wrong. A pile of clothes, discarded in the middle of the path. It wasn't just one set of clothes, it was three. 3 hunting jackets, 3 pairs of boots, even their hats, all neatly piled together like someone had taken the time to arrange them. But there were no people, no bodies, just clothes. My stomach twisted, and I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I'd been a ranger for years, and I'd seen my share of accidents, of lost hikers, but this felt deliberate. I wanted to turn back, to radio for backup, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. There were still people missing. So I steeled myself and kept moving, the weight of dread settling over me like a thick blanket. The growl came again, louder, closer. This time, it was followed by the sound of something large moving through the trees, heavy footsteps crushing the underbrush. I spun around, flashlight darting through the darkness, but again there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I quickened my pace, heading toward the top of the ridge. I was almost there when I saw him, one of the hunters, standing at the edge of the clearing. Relief washed over me for a brief second before I noticed something was off. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, his back to me, staring into the trees. "Hey!" I called out, rushing toward him. "Are you all right?" He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. When I got closer, my heart sank. His face was pale, his eyes wide, but they weren't focused on anything. They just stared straight ahead, empty, like he wasn't really there. His body was rigid, his hands limp at his sides. I reached out to grab his shoulder, but as soon as I touched him, he collapsed to the ground, unconscious. I checked his pulse. It was there, but faint. I tried to wake him, shaking him gently, calling his name, but he didn't respond. He was breathing, but it was shallow and his skin felt cold, clammy. I hoisted him up, draping his arm over my shoulder, and started the long, slow trek back down the ridge. I still didn't know what had happened to the others, but my gut told me I wasn't going to find them alive. As we made our way down, that growl came again, closer now, louder. I could hear it moving through the trees behind me, following us. My heart pounded, my muscles screaming with the effort of dragging the unconscious hunter down the steep path. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The footsteps were right behind me now, crashing through the underbrush, something massive moving just out of sight. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out, and for a moment I thought I saw something, a shape, too tall to be a bear, too big to be anything that should have been out there. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. By the time I reached the truck, I was drenched in sweat, my arms trembling with exhaustion. I threw the hunter into the passenger seat, slammed the door, and floored it. The thing in the woods was still out there, still following, but as soon as we hit the road, the footsteps stopped. I didn't stop driving until we were back at the station. In the days that followed, search teams combed the area. They never found the other hunters. No bodies, no tracks, no sign of them at all, just their clothes, neatly piled at the top of the ridge. The hunter I'd found eventually woke up, but he didn't remember anything. Not what had happened, not what they were hunting, not even the strange noise he'd described on the phone. He just kept repeating one thing, over and over. It wasn't an animal, and I believed him. Because whatever was up there on Bear Ridge, whatever followed me through those trees that night, it wasn't something I ever want to see again. And I hope to God it never finds me. Story 12. The growl that shook our tent that night wasn't from any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep, primal, and utterly terrifying. In that moment, I realized our family camping trip had turned into something straight out of a nightmare. We'd been looking forward to this vacation for months. My wife, Sarah, our 2 kids, Emma, 10, and Jake, 8, and I had planned a week-long camping trip in the Cascade Mountains. We were experienced campers, but this was our first time venturing this deep into the backcountry. The promise of pristine wilderness and complete solitude had been irresistible. The first 2 days were perfect. We hiked, fished in crystal-clear streams, and spent our evenings around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The kids were in heaven, free from the constraints of city life and school. It was on the 3rd night that everything changed. We'd settled into our tent after a long day of hiking. The kids were exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately. Sarah and I lay awake for a while, talking in whispers about the day's adventures and planning for tomorrow. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath us. At first, I thought it might be thunder, but the sky had been clear all day. This sound was closer, more alive. Sarah gripped my arm. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Before I could answer, we heard it again, louder this time. It was undeniably coming from just outside our tent. The kids stirred in their sleep, and I prayed they wouldn't wake up. Whatever was out there, I didn't want them to know about it. Not yet. I reached for the flashlight we kept by our sleeping bags, my hand shaking slightly. "Stay here," I whispered to Sarah. "I'm going to take a look." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. I could see she wanted to protest, to tell me not to go out there, but we both knew we needed to know what we were dealing with. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and poked my head out. The night was eerily still. No breeze, no rustling leaves, not even the usual chorus of insects. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I swept the flashlight beam around our campsite. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then as the light passed over the tree line at the edge of our clearing, I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting the light, set high above the ground, much higher than any normal animal. My breath caught in my throat. Those eyes blinked once, and then were gone. I ducked back into the tent, my heart pounding. "There's something out there," I whispered to Sarah. Something big. As if in response to my words, another growl rumbled through the night, closer this time, so close I could almost feel the vibration of it in my chest. That's when Emma woke up. "Daddy?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "What's that noise?" I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Probably just a bear wandering by. Go back to sleep." But even as I said it, another growl shook the tent, and this time it was accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps. Whatever was out there, it was circling our campsite. Jake was awake now too, his eyes wide with fear. "That doesn't sound like a bear," he said, his voice small and trembling. Sarah pulled both kids close to her, and I positioned myself between them and the tent entrance. We sat there in terrified silence, listening to the creature as it moved around our camp. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell across our tent. The creature was right outside, its bulk blotting out the moonlight. We could hear its heavy breathing, smell its musky, animal scent. Emma whimpered, burying her face in Sarah's shoulder. Jake was shaking but trying hard to be brave. I knew I had to do something. We couldn't just sit here and wait for whatever it was to leave, but what could I do against something that big? That's when I remembered the bear spray in my backpack. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Stay here," I whispered to my family. "Don't make a sound." I crawled slowly towards my pack, trying not to make any sudden movements. The creature was still there, just on the other side of the thin fabric of our tent. I could hear it sniffing, as if trying to catch our scent. Just as my hand closed around the canister of bear spray, the creature let out another bone-shaking growl. And then, to my horror, I saw a massive, clawed hand press against the side of the tent. The fabric bulged inward under its weight, and I could make out the shape of each enormous finger. The claws alone were longer than my hand. Emma screamed, and all hell broke loose. The creature roared, a sound so loud and terrifying it felt like it could split the night in two. The hand withdrew, only to come crashing down on top of the tent. I didn't think, I just acted. I unzipped the tent and burst out, bear spray at the ready. "Get out!" I yelled to my family. "Run!" In the chaos that followed, I caught only glimpses of the creature. It was enormous, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur. But it was the eyes that struck me most. Intelligent, almost human-like, filled with a primal hunger that chilled me to my core. I sprayed the bear spray directly at its face. The creature reared back with a roar of pain and anger. It bought us just enough time. Sarah emerged from the tent, Emma in her arms and Jake clinging to her leg. I grabbed Jake and we ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or stealth. All that mattered was putting distance between us and that thing. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they would give out. Finally, we stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. For a long moment, we just sat there, listening, but the only sounds were our own ragged breathing and the normal noises of the forest at night. Whatever that creature was, it hadn't followed us. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of our situation sank in. We were lost in the wilderness in the middle of the night, with no supplies and no idea which direction our campsite was in. And somewhere out there was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen or heard of. "What was that thing, Dad?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. I shook my head. "I don't know, buddy. I really don't know." We spent the rest of the night huddled together in that clearing, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, we began the long, terrifying journey back to civilization. It took us 2 days to find our way out of the backcountry. 2 days of constant fear, of jumping at every shadow and snapping twig. When we finally reached the ranger station, we were exhausted, hungry, and still shaken to our core. The rangers listened to our story with skepticism. They suggested it might have been a bear, or that fear and darkness had played tricks on our minds, but they couldn't explain the claw marks we'd found on trees as we made our way back. Claw marks far too high for any known animal in the area. In the weeks and months that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We researched cryptids and local legends, pored over grainy photos of supposed Bigfoot sightings, but nothing quite matched what we'd encountered that night. The experience changed us. We still camp, still love the outdoors, but we're more cautious now. We stick to established campgrounds, always camp in groups, and never venture too deep into the backcountry. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about what's out there in the deep woods, about the creatures that might be watching from the shadows, just beyond the reach of our campfire's light. I don't know if we'll ever fully understand what happened that night in the Cascades, but I do know this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that challenge everything we think we know about nature and reality. And sometimes, when I look into the eyes of my children, I see a flicker of that same knowledge, a reminder that we're not always at the top of the food chain, and that the wilderness holds secrets we may never fully comprehend. Story 13. Some things you see in the wild stick with you forever. No matter how much time passes, no matter how many times you try to explain it away, there are moments that get burned into your memory. This one night by that remote lake deep in the woods is something I'll never forget, and not just because of what I saw, but because of what I felt. The fear, the confusion, the sheer terror of knowing that I wasn't alone out there. It started like any other trip. My buddy Dave and I had decided to get away for the weekend, just the two of us, no cell phones, no distractions. We picked a lake we'd been to once before, about a year ago, and set out early in the morning with our backpacks and fishing gear. The hike was long and the trail wasn't exactly well maintained, but we liked it that way. The remoteness was the appeal. When you're out there, it feels like the rest of the world doesn't exist. We arrived in the early afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting everything in that golden light that makes the forest seem magical. The lake was beautiful, calm, still, like glass. The air was cool but comfortable, the kind of crispness you only get when you're deep in the wilderness. We set up camp a few yards back from the water, under a couple of old pine trees that provided decent cover. It was perfect. We spent the rest of the afternoon fishing, barely speaking, just enjoying the quiet. The fish weren't biting much, but we didn't care. The peace was what we were after. As the sun set, we lit a small fire and sat around it, cooking some canned food and telling stories like we always did. It wasn't until the fire started to die down, when the last sliver of daylight disappeared behind the trees, that I started to feel it. This strange unease, like the woods were suddenly too quiet. At first, I thought it was just the typical nerves you get when you're out in the middle of nowhere at night. It's natural to feel a little jumpy when the only light comes from your fire, and every crack of a branch sounds like something bigger than it should be. But this was different. The silence was thick, like the forest itself had stopped breathing. "Do you hear that?" I asked Dave, trying to keep my voice casual, though the knot in my stomach was growing. He looked up from the fire, eyebrows furrowed. "Hear what?" "That's the thing," I said, staring into the darkness beyond the fire's glow. I don't hear anything. It's too quiet. Dave shrugged, taking a sip from his water bottle. We're out in the middle of nowhere, man. It's supposed to be quiet. But it wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. No crickets, no frogs, not even the occasional hoot of an owl. Just nothing. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire and the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I'm going to take a walk, just to, shake off the nerves. You good? Dave asked, sounding only mildly concerned. Yeah, just need to stretch my legs, I said, grabbing my flashlight. I didn't want to admit how uneasy I was. Not yet. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I walked down to the water's edge, shining my flashlight across the lake. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the glassy surface of the water, but it didn't make me feel any better. The light bounced back off the trees on the far side of the lake, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. I scanned the area, hoping to see something that would explain the strange silence, but there was nothing. I was about to turn back when I saw it. On the opposite side of the lake, maybe 50 or 60 yards away, something moved. At first I thought it was a deer. The shape was tall, dark, and hunched over as it drank from the water's edge. But as my flashlight beam caught it, the figure jerked up, straightening in a way that no deer or animal should move. It was tall, taller than any animal I'd ever seen in the wild, and its posture was all wrong. It stood on two legs, its body thin but unnaturally long, with arms that seemed to hang too low. I froze, my heart slamming in my chest, as the thing turned its head toward me. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the reflection of my light, locked onto me from across the lake. I couldn't make out its face, but those eyes, they stared at me with a kind of intelligence that no animal should have. And for the longest second of my life, it just stood there watching me, motionless. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. Then, without warning, the thing turned and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the shadows faster than anything that size should have been able to move. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted back to the camp, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I ran. When I got back to the fire, Dave looked up, startled. "Jesus, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "There's something out there," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "Across the lake, I saw it. I don't even know what it was, but it wasn't an animal." Dave stood up, suddenly serious. "What do you mean? What did you see?" "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "It was standing on two legs, like a person, but it was too tall, too fast. It looked at me, Dave. It looked right at me. For a moment, he just stared at me, processing what I was saying. Then, without a word, he grabbed his own flashlight and motioned for me to follow him. We walked back to the edge of the lake, side by side, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. My heart was still racing, my skin crawling with the memory of those eyes watching me from across the water. When we reached the shore, Dave scanned the far side with his light, his face tight with concentration. But there was nothing. The trees on the other side were still, the water calm, as if nothing had ever been there. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "I know what I saw," I said, my pulse still pounding in my ears. We stood there for a few minutes, the silence pressing in around us. Finally, Dave sighed and turned back toward the camp. "Look, maybe it was just a trick of the light. We've been out here all day. Your mind could be playing games on you." But I wasn't so sure. I knew what I saw, and the way it had moved, the way it had watched me. It wasn't natural. We spent the rest of the night on edge, both of us too uneasy to sleep. I kept thinking about those eyes, the way they seemed to follow me, even after the creature had disappeared into the trees. Every time the wind rustled the branches or the fire popped, I tensed, expecting to see that tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the camp, watching. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn finally broke over the horizon, we packed up camp in record time. Neither of us spoke much, but I could tell Dave was rattled too, even if he didn't want to admit it. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us through the trees. But we made it back to the car without incident, and by the time we hit the road, the tension had started to ease. Still, the memory of what I saw lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. I haven't been back to that lake since. Every time I think about going, I remember those eyes watching me from the darkness, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. And the worst part, I don't think it was afraid of me. I think it was just curious, and that's what scares me the most. Story 14. The howl that echoed through the mountains that night was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the familiar cry of a wolf or coyote, but something altogether different, something that sent chills down my spine and made my blood run cold. Little did I know that unearthly sound was about to turn our innocent night hike into a terrifying ordeal that would haunt us for years to come. My name's Mike, and I've been a tour guide in the Rocky Mountains for over a decade. I've led hundreds of hikes, from easy nature walks to challenging backcountry expeditions, but nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what happened on that moonlit night in late September. It was supposed to be a simple excursion, a full-moon hike that I'd run dozens of times before. Tourists love the idea of experiencing the wilderness under the soft glow of moonlight, and it's usually a peaceful, almost magical experience. That night, I had a group of 8, 2 couples in their 30s, a family of 3 with a teenage daughter, and a solo traveler in his mid-40s. We set out just as the sun was setting, the sky a canvas of oranges and purples that slowly faded to deep blue. As darkness fell, the full moon rose, bathing the landscape in silvery light. The group was in high spirits, chatting and laughing as we made our way along the well-worn trail. I pointed out various nighttime flora and fauna, explaining how the ecosystem changes after dark. We were about an hour into the hike when we reached Eagle's Point, a rocky outcropping that offers a stunning view of the valley below. As the group oohed and ahed over the moonlit vista, I heard it, a faint, distant sound that made me pause mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" asked Sarah, the teenage daughter, her eyes wide. I nodded, straining my ears. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft whisper of wind through the pines. Then it came again, a long, mournful cry that seemed to resonate through the very mountains themselves. "Wow," breathed Tom, one of the men from the couples. "Is that a wolf?" I frowned, shaking my head. "No, not a wolf. I'm not sure what." Before I could finish, the cry came again, louder this time. It started low, almost like the growl of some massive beast, then rose to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever encountered in these mountains. The group's excitement quickly turned to unease. I could see the fear creeping into their eyes, the way they unconsciously huddled closer together. "It's probably just some kind of bird," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's start heading back. It's getting late." We set off down the trail, our pace a bit quicker than before. The cheerful chatter had died down, replaced by tense silence, broken only by the crunch of gravel under our boots. We'd been walking for about 10 minutes when we heard it again. This time, it was much closer, and unmistakably coming from somewhere up ahead on the trail. The group stopped dead in their tracks. "Mike," whispered Lisa, clutching her husband's arm. "What is that?" I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but we need to keep moving. Stay close together." We pressed on, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through the group. I found myself constantly scanning the trees around us, searching for any sign of movement in the moonlit shadows. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, really. A large, dark shape moving between the trees off to our right. It was there and gone so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it, but the gasp from Sarah told me she'd seen it too. "There's something out there," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, trying to keep my own fear in check. "Let's pick up the pace," I said. "The parking lot isn't far now." We started moving faster, almost jogging down the trail. The sound came again, closer than ever, a hair-raising howl that seemed to surround us from all sides. And then we saw it. It stepped out onto the trail ahead of us, a massive shape silhouetted in the moonlight. It was vaguely humanoid, but much larger than any man, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. Its head was oddly shaped, almost pointed, and I could have sworn I saw the glint of teeth in the moonlight. For a moment, we all stood frozen, staring at the creature in disbelief. Then it let out another of those bone-chilling howls, and chaos erupted. People screamed, turning to run back up the trail. I shouted for them to stay together, but panic had taken over. I saw the family of 3 dart off the trail into the woods, the others scattering in different directions. The creature moved with incredible speed for its size, bounding down the trail towards us. I grabbed Sarah, who was closest to me, and pulled her off the path and behind a large boulder. We crouched there, hardly daring to breathe, as the thing loped past our hiding spot. The ground seemed to shake with each of its strides. Once it had passed, I risked a glance around the boulder. The trail was empty. Both the creature and the rest of my group had vanished into the night. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice choked with tears. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly through the haze of fear. "We need to get back to the parking lot," I said. "That's where everyone will head eventually. We'll stick to the woods parallel to the trail. Hopefully, that thing won't double back this way." We set off, moving as quietly as we could through the underbrush. Every sound made us freeze. Every shadow looked like a lurking monster. But slowly, steadily, we made our way down the mountain. It felt like hours, but it was probably only about 45 minutes before we saw the welcome glow of the parking lot lights through the trees. As we emerged from the woods, I was relieved to see most of the group already there, huddled around their cars. There were cries of relief as we joined them. Everyone was accounted for except Tom and his wife, Jenny. As we debated whether to go back and search for them or call for help, we heard crashing sounds from the woods. We all tensed, fearing the return of the creature. But it was Tom and Jenny who stumbled into the parking lot, out of breath and wide-eyed with fear. "We saw it," Tom gasped. "Up close. It was not human," Jenny finished. "But not an animal either. What was that thing?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. What could I say? That we'd just encountered something that shouldn't exist, that defied all logical explanation. We reported the incident, of course. The park rangers searched the area, but found nothing beyond some strange tracks that they attributed to a large bear walking on its hind legs. They listened to our story with poorly concealed skepticism, clearly believing we'd allowed our imaginations and the darkness to get the better of us. But I know what I saw. We all do. That thing on the trail was no bear, no known animal of any kind. It was something else, something that shouldn't be possible. In the weeks and months that followed, I pored over local legends, cryptozoology forums, anything that might offer an explanation for what we encountered. I found plenty of stories. Tales of Bigfoot, of skinwalkers, of creatures that lurk in the dark places of the world. But nothing quite matched what we'd seen. I still work as a tour guide, still lead night hikes even. But things are different now. I'm more cautious, more alert. I find myself constantly scanning the trees, straining my ears for any hint of that unearthly howl, and sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the mountains are bathed in silvery light, I think I hear it, distant and faint, but unmistakable. A reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation. It's been years since that night, but the memory remains as vivid as ever. The rest of the group has moved on, convincing themselves it was just a bear or a trick of the light and shadows. But I know the truth. There's something out there in the mountains, something that comes out under the full moon, announcing its presence with a howl that chills the soul. And though I hope I never encounter it again, A part of me wonders if someday, somehow, I'll unlock the mystery of what we saw that night. Until then, I'll keep leading my tours, sharing the beauty of the mountains with others, but I'll always be watching, listening, ready for the moment when that howl echoes through the night once more. Story 15. There are certain things you expect to find when you come back to camp after a long day of hiking. Maybe some stray branches fallen across your gear, a bit of wind shifting things around, or a curious animal nosing through your supplies. But what I found that evening wasn't something I could explain away. It wasn't something I could shake off. When I saw the circle of carefully arranged branches around our tents, I felt a kind of cold dread I had never experienced before. I should have trusted that feeling. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip, just a weekend in the wilderness with my girlfriend, Emma. We both loved the outdoors, and we had picked a spot deep in the national forest where we wouldn't run into anyone else. Solitude was exactly what we were after. Just us, the trees, and miles of unbroken wilderness. The hike in had been peaceful enough. We'd followed a narrow trail that eventually vanished, leaving us to navigate by map and compass. It was the kind of isolation we thrived on. By the time we found a suitable clearing to set up camp, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows through the dense trees. We were miles from the nearest road, and the quiet was absolute. Perfect, I thought. That first night, we cooked dinner over the fire, drank some wine we'd packed in, and laughed about how far away we felt from the rest of the world. It was exactly what we needed, a break from the constant noise of life. As the fire died down, the sky darkened into a brilliant blanket of stars, and we climbed into our tents, falling asleep to the soft hum of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. But when I woke up the next morning, something was different. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper than it had the day before. I tried to brush it off as just a change in the weather. Emma was already up, making coffee, and I didn't want to spoil the mood with my sudden unease. We had plans to hike further into the woods that day, to explore a nearby stream we'd seen on the map. It was supposed to be another perfect day. After breakfast, we packed our day packs and set off, leaving our tents behind. The trail was tougher this time, the undergrowth thicker, and the path steeper. But the scenery was worth it. Thick, towering pines stretching into the sky, ferns carpeting the forest floor, and the constant murmur of the stream somewhere ahead of us. By the time we reached the water, we were exhausted but exhilarated. We spent the afternoon there, wading in the cool water, enjoying the isolation. Not a single soul for miles, just us. We didn't head back until late in the afternoon, our legs tired but spirits high. But as we approached the campsite, I felt it again, that creeping unease, stronger this time. The air felt different, like something was off. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the rustling leaves, the distant birdsong. But the moment we stepped into the clearing, everything changed. Emma saw it first. "What the hell?" she muttered, stopping dead in her tracks. I followed her gaze and froze. Around our tents, arranged in a near-perfect circle, were branches, some of them thick, others thin, but all carefully placed, almost woven together. They were stacked in a way that looked deliberate, like someone or something had taken the time to create the pattern. The circle was just wide enough to encompass both our tents, almost as if it were marking the space, enclosing us. "What is this?" Emma's voice was shaky now, the confusion in her tone matching the chill running down my spine. I walked closer, crouching down to inspect the branches. They were fresh, broken from nearby trees, the leaves still green. The circle was neat, precise, almost ritualistic in its design. I ran my fingers along one of the branches, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. "This wasn't here when we left," I said, standing up, my voice tight. "No one else has been out here. It doesn't make any sense." Emma walked a slow circle around the perimeter, keeping her distance from the branches, her eyes darting nervously to the surrounding trees. Who would do something like this? And why? I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, searching for some logical explanation, but nothing fit. We were miles from anyone, deep in the forest. This wasn't some prank or joke. Whoever or whatever had done this had done it while we were gone, and they'd done it silently. "We should leave," Emma said, her voice firmer now. "I don't care what it is. I don't want to stay here." I nodded, already making the same decision in my head. But as we started packing up our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My eyes kept flicking to the tree line, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just that oppressive, suffocating silence. The sun was sinking lower now, casting long, slanted rays through the trees. The shadows grew darker, stretching across the clearing as we worked quickly to break down the tents. My heart raced, the urgency in my movements fueled by the growing sense of dread. We needed to get out of there before the dark swallowed us whole. "Do you hear that?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. I stopped, listening. The woods were silent, too silent. But then, faintly, from somewhere deeper in the forest, came a sound. It was distant, muffled, but unmistakable, a low, guttural moan, like something large was moving through the trees. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. "We need to go, now," Emma said, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. We threw the last of our gear into our backpacks, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the straps. The sound was getting closer now, louder, more distinct, footsteps, heavy, deliberate and slow. Whatever was out there, it was coming. We grabbed our packs and bolted, not bothering to look back. The path was barely visible in the fading light, but we didn't stop, didn't slow down. The only sounds were the pounding of our footsteps and the blood rushing in my ears. But the footsteps behind us, they were still there. I could hear them now, clearer than before. They were steady, almost rhythmic, crunching through the underbrush, keeping pace with us. My heart raced, my breath coming in ragged gasps as we pushed through the trees, the darkness closing in around us. "We're almost there," I panted, though I had no idea how far we had to go. The trail seemed endless, the trees stretching on forever. But we couldn't stop. We had to keep moving. Suddenly, Emma stopped dead in her tracks, grabbing my arm. I nearly crashed into her, my flashlight beam swinging wildly in the dark. "There," she whispered, her voice shaking. I followed her gaze, and my stomach dropped. Just off the trail, standing between two trees, was a figure, tall, too tall to be human, its limbs long and thin, its body hunched. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze locked on us, watching. For a moment, we stood frozen, the three of us locked in some kind of silent standoff. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching us, its presence suffocating, filling the air with a sense of dread so thick I could barely breathe. "Run," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't need to be told twice. We took off, sprinting down the trail as fast as we could. I didn't look back, didn't dare. The sound of the footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me, pressing down on me like a weight. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. By the time we got there, we were both gasping for air, drenched in sweat. We threw our packs into the back seat and jumped in, slamming the doors shut. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the trailhead, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching us. But there was nothing, just the empty forest, dark and silent. We drove out of there as fast as we could, neither of us speaking until we were miles away. Even then, the weight of what had happened hung between us, heavy and unspoken. We never went back to that spot. In fact, I haven't been camping since. Whatever was out there in those woods, whatever had made that circle, it wasn't something I wanted to understand. And I'm certain, even now, that it's still out there, waiting for the next campers who wander too deep into its territory. Story 16. The trees lay broken and uprooted, as if a giant hand had swept through the forest in a fit of rage. But it wasn't the destruction that chilled me to the bone. It was the claw marks, deep, savage gouges in the bark that no known animal could have made. In that moment, standing in the heart of the devastation, I realized we had stumbled upon something that would change our lives forever. My name is Dr. Elena Reyes, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large predators. I've spent the last 15 years studying bears, wolves, and mountain lions across North America. But nothing in my extensive experience could have prepared me for what my team and I discovered in the remote wilderness of northern Idaho. It was supposed to be a routine research expedition. My team, consisting of my assistant Jake, our tracking expert Maria, and our newest member, a graduate student named Chris, had come to investigate reports of unusual animal activity in the area. Local hunters had been telling stories of massive tracks, mutilated game animals, and eerie noises in the night. Most of my colleagues had dismissed these tales as exaggerations or misidentifications, but something about the consistency of the reports had piqued my interest. We'd been in the field for 3 days, setting up camera traps and collecting samples, when we found it, the swathe of destruction that would upend everything we thought we knew about the natural world. It was Chris who spotted it first. We were hiking along a ridgeline, surveying the valley below, when he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. "Dr. Reyes," he called, his voice tight with confusion and a hint of fear. "And you need to see this." I made my way over to where he stood, followed closely by Jake and Maria. As I reached Chris's side, I saw what had caught his attention, and my breath caught in my throat. Stretching out before us was a path of devastation, cutting through the dense forest like a scar. Trees lay splintered and broken, some uprooted entirely, their massive root systems exposed to the air. It looked as if a tornado had touched down, except the destruction was too linear, too purposeful. "What could have done this?" Jake whispered, his usual bravado replaced by awe and a touch of fear. I shook my head, unable to formulate a response. In all my years studying wildlife, I'd never seen anything like this. We made our way down into the valley, picking our way carefully through the debris. As we got closer, the true scale of the destruction became apparent. Some of the felled trees were centuries old, their trunks thicker than a car. Whatever had done this possessed strength beyond anything I could imagine. That's when Maria called out, her voice sharp with excitement and disbelief. "Guys, you need to see this." We hurried over to where she stood, examining the trunk of a massive pine that had somehow remained standing amidst the chaos. As we drew closer, I saw what had caught her attention and felt my world tilt on its axis. Carved into the bark of the tree were claw marks, but not just any claw marks. These gouges were easily 8 inches long and an inch deep, spaced apart in a pattern that suggested a hand far larger than any known animal. That's not possible," Chris stammered, his face pale. I reached out, running my fingers along the gouges. They were real, tangible proof of something that couldn't exist. "We need to document everything," I said, snapping into research mode to keep the rising tide of disbelief and fear at bay. "Chris, start taking photos. Jake, help me collect bark samples from these marks. Maria, see if you can find any tracks or scat in the area." We worked in tense silence, each of us grappling with the implications of what we'd found. As a scientist, I wanted to remain objective, to consider all possible explanations. But with each piece of evidence we collected, it became harder to deny the impossible truth staring us in the face. Whatever had done this wasn't a known species. It was something else, something that defied our understanding of what was possible in nature. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the destroyed forest, we made the decision to set up camp nearby. Part of me wanted to flee, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the researcher in me knew we couldn't leave, not when we were on the verge of what could be the scientific discovery of the century. We pitched our tents in a small clearing just outside the path of destruction, building a fire more for comfort than warmth. As night fell, an uneasy silence settled over our camp. The usual chorus of nighttime forest sounds was noticeably absent, as if the local wildlife was still too scared to return. "What do you think it is?" Chris finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I sighed, poking at the fire with a stick. "I don't know," I admitted, "but whatever it is, it's big, bigger than any known animal in North America, and intelligent, judging by the purposeful nature of the destruction." "You don't think—" Jake started, then paused, as if afraid to voice his thoughts. "Could it be, a Bigfoot or something? A week ago, I would have laughed at the suggestion. But now, faced with evidence I couldn't explain, I found myself considering possibilities I'd always dismissed as myth and legend. "And I think," I said carefully, "that we need to keep an open mind. Whatever did this doesn't fit into our current understanding of wildlife in this region. We need to gather more data before we jump to any conclusions." As if in response to my words, a sound echoed through the night, a long, low howl that was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It started deep, almost subsonic, then rose to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. We all froze, staring wide-eyed at each other across the fire. The howl came again, closer this time, and with it, the sound of something large moving through the forest. "Get in the tents," I whispered urgently. "Now!" We scrambled to douse the fire and retreat to the relative safety of our tents. I ended up sharing with Maria, both of us huddled in our sleeping bags, straining our ears for any sound of approach. The night seemed to stretch on forever. We could hear it moving around our camp, heavy footsteps and the occasional snap of a branch. At one point, I could have sworn I saw a massive shadow pass by the tent, momentarily blocking out the moonlight. None of us slept. We lay there, hearts pounding, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. As soon as it was light enough, we emerged from our tents, half expecting to find our camp destroyed. But everything was as we'd left it, except for the tracks. Huge, humanoid footprints circled our campsite. Each print was easily 20 inches long, with clear impressions of 5 toes. The stride length between prints was massive, suggesting a creature of incredible size. We spent the morning documenting the tracks, taking photos and measurements, making plaster casts. The scientific part of my brain was in overdrive, analyzing every detail. But another part of me, a more primal part, was screaming that we needed to leave, to get out of these woods and never come back. In the end, it was the weather that made the decision for us. Dark clouds had been gathering all morning, and by midday, the first rumbles of thunder echoed through the valley. We couldn't risk being caught in a storm. Not out here, not with that thing potentially still in the area. We packed up our camp and all our evidence, making our way back to our base camp as quickly as we could. The hike out was tense, all of us jumping at every sound, constantly scanning the trees around us. It wasn't until we were in our vehicles, driving back towards civilization, that I allowed myself to really think about what we'd discovered. If our findings were real, and every scrap of physical evidence suggested they were, then we had just confirmed the existence of a creature that science had long dismissed as myth. The implications were staggering. It would rewrite our understanding of zoology, of evolution, of what was possible in nature. But as I thought about those massive claw marks, those huge footprints, I couldn't help but wonder, were we ready for such a discovery? What would it mean for the creature if its existence was revealed to the world? As we drove out of the mountains, I made a decision. We would analyze our evidence, write up our findings, but we wouldn't go public. Not yet. Not until we understood more about what we were dealing with. Because one thing was clear, there was something out there in those woods, something big, something powerful, something that had managed to stay hidden from science for centuries. And until we knew more, until we could be sure of protecting both the creature and the public, its secret would remain safe with us. But I knew I'd be back. The scientist in me, the part that always hungered for knowledge and understanding, wouldn't let this go. Somewhere out there was a creature that could change everything we thought we knew about the natural world, and I was determined to find it. Story 17. The howl that echoed through the forest that night wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It sent chills down my spine and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Little did I know, it was just the beginning of the most terrifying night of my career as a forest ranger. I'd been working in Blackwood National Forest for over a decade, and I thought I'd seen and heard it all: coyotes, wolves, even the occasional mountain lion. I could identify them all by their calls. But this was something different. It was a crisp autumn night, and I was doing my usual rounds, checking on campsites and making sure no one was breaking park rules. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow through the trees. I'd just finished my coffee when I heard it, a long, low howl that seemed to reverberate through the entire forest. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, closer this time. It was a sound that seemed to mix the deep bass of a wolf's howl with something almost human. My heart started racing, and I felt a bead of sweat form on my forehead despite the chilly air. I radioed back to base, letting them know I was going to investigate. They advised caution, reminding me of the recent reports of unusually large wildlife in the area. I assured them I'd be careful, but inside, I was starting to feel a sense of dread I couldn't quite explain. As I made my way deeper into the woods, following the direction of the sound, the forest seemed to grow quieter. The usual nighttime chorus of insects and nocturnal animals had fallen silent, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I swept my flashlight back and forth, looking for any signs of movement. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the soft mud near a small stream. But these weren't any normal animal tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and they seemed to show a mix of human and animal characteristics. The shape was almost like a human foot, but with clear claw marks at the ends of the toes. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. A bear, maybe, but bears don't walk on two legs for extended periods, and these tracks clearly showed a bipedal gait. I took some photos with my phone, my hands shaking slightly as I did so. As I stood up from examining the prints, I heard a twig snap nearby. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It was big, much bigger than a person, and covered in dark fur. But it moved with an eerie grace, almost gliding between the trunks. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I called out, "Hello? This is Ranger Mike. Is someone there?" My voice sounded small and scared in the vast, silent forest. There was no response, but I could feel eyes on me. It was an instinct, a primal feeling of being watched by a predator. I swept my flashlight around again, trying to catch another glimpse of whatever I'd seen, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. I decided to head back to my truck, whatever was out there. I wasn't equipped to handle it alone in the dark. As I turned to leave, I heard a low, rumbling growl from somewhere to my left. It was close, too close. I broke into a run, no longer caring about stealth or professionalism. Pure survival instinct took over. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face as I ran. I could hear something moving parallel to me, keeping pace easily. It was toying with me, I realized with a jolt of terror. Whatever this thing was, it could have caught me at any time. Just as I thought my lungs would burst, I broke through the tree line and saw my truck. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. As I yanked the door open, I heard one final howl, a sound of frustration or maybe a warning. It echoed through the night as I slammed the door and started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I reached the ranger station. My colleagues were shocked at my appearance, disheveled, out of breath, with small cuts on my face from the branches. When I told them what happened, I could see the disbelief in their eyes. But then I showed them the photos of the footprints, and their expressions changed to concern and confusion. We called in a wildlife expert the next day to examine the prints and the area where I'd had my encounter. She was baffled, unable to match the prints to any known species. We set up camera traps in the area, but they never caught anything out of the ordinary. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night in Blackwood Forest. Was it some unknown species, a hoax, or something else entirely? All I know is that I no longer do night patrols alone, and whenever I'm in that part of the forest, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The incident changed me. I've always respected the wilderness, but now I understand just how much we don't know about what's out there. The forest holds secrets, and sometimes it's better not to uncover them all. Weeks passed, and life at the ranger station slowly returned to normal. My colleagues stopped giving me sideways glances, and the whispers behind my back faded away. But I couldn't forget. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark shape moving through the trees with impossible grace. I threw myself into research, spending my off hours poring over books about local wildlife and folklore. I reached out to cryptozoologists, though I was careful not to let my superiors know about that. Most of them were dead ends, spinning wild theories about government cover-ups or interdimensional beings. But one of them, a soft-spoken professor from a nearby university, took my account seriously. "What you're describing," he said during one of our long phone conversations, "bears some similarities to legends from several Native American tribes in the region. They speak of a creature that walks like a man, but has the strength and ferocity of a bear." I latched onto this information, hungry for any explanation that might make sense of what I'd experienced. The professor warned me not to jump to conclusions, but I could hear the excitement in his voice. He wanted to believe as much as I did. As winter settled over the forest, blanketing everything in snow, the incident began to feel like a distant dream. But then the reports started coming in. Hikers describing strange noises in the night, campers waking to find their sites ransacked, with tracks in the snow that didn't match any known animal. Each report sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. It wasn't just in my head. Something was out there. My supervisor called me into his office after the 5th report. "Mike," he said, his face grave, "I need you to level with me. What's really going on out there?" I told him everything again, not holding back any details this time. To my surprise, he listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he let out a long sigh. "I've been working these forests for 30 years, he said, "and there's always been stories, things that don't quite add up. Most of the time, there's a logical explanation. But sometimes," he trailed off, looking out the window at the snow-covered trees, "sometimes I wonder if we really know as much as we think we do about what lives in these woods." He turned back to me, his eyes sharp. "I'm putting together a small team to investigate. I want you on it. But Mike, we need to keep this quiet. No talk of monsters or cryptids. We stick to the facts." "Understood," I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. Finally, we were going to get to the bottom of this. The team consisted of myself, 2 other experienced rangers, and a wildlife biologist from the State University. We set out just before dawn, the forest silent and still in the pale winter light. As we moved deeper into the woods, following the coordinates from the most recent sighting, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We found the campsite easily enough. It was a mess. The tent shredded and supplies scattered across the snow, but it was the tracks that made us all stop short. They were just like the ones I'd seen that night, huge, bipedal with clear claw marks. The biologist knelt to examine them, her face a mask of concentration. "This is unprecedented," she murmured, taking measurements and samples. The stride length, the depth of the impressions. Whatever made these would have to be incredibly large and heavy. As she worked, I scanned the tree line, my hand resting on the tranquilizer gun at my hip. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement, just like before. Without thinking, I took off after it, ignoring the shouts of my teammates. I crashed through the snowy underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The shape always stayed just ahead of me, visible for a moment before vanishing behind a tree or rock. I don't know how long I ran, but suddenly I found myself in a small clearing, alone and disoriented. As I stood there, trying to catch my breath, I heard a low, rumbling sound behind me. Slowly, I turned around and my heart nearly stopped. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a creature that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of bear and human features, with intelligent eyes that held me frozen in place. For a long moment, we stared at each other, neither moving. Then, to my utter astonishment, it spoke. The words were garbled, barely intelligible, but unmistakably an attempt at human speech. "Leave," it growled, the sound sending vibrations through my chest. Not safe. Before I could react, it turned and loped into the forest, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen and heard. When my team finally found me, I was still standing in that clearing, staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. They peppered me with questions, but I couldn't find the words to explain. How could I describe something that shouldn't exist? In the end, our official report was vague and inconclusive. Unusual wildlife activity, possible bear encounters, further study needed. But I knew the truth, as did my teammates who had seen the tracks and my shell-shocked expression. There are things in this world that defy easy explanation, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our knowledge. That night in the forest changed me forever, opening my eyes to possibilities I had never considered. Now, when I look out at the vast expanse of trees surrounding our little ranger station, I no longer see just a forest. I see a realm of mysteries, of untold wonders and terrors. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I swear I can hear that howl again, echoing through the trees. A reminder that the line between legend and reality is thinner than we think, and that some secrets of the wilderness may never be fully understood. Story 18. The first scream jolted me awake, my heart pounding as I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed it, but then it came again, a high, terrified shriek that cut through the night air like a knife. It wasn't human. My name's Alex, and I've been an avid camper for most of my life. I thought I'd seen it all: bears, mountain lions, even the occasional angry moose. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in the backcountry of Yellowstone. It was supposed to be a routine camping trip, just me and my 2 best friends, Sarah and Mike. We'd hiked deep into the park, far from the touristy areas, seeking that perfect blend of solitude and wilderness. As the sun set on our first day, we'd felt on top of the world, marveling at the stars emerging in the clear night sky. Now, huddled in our tent, those same stars felt cold and distant as another scream echoed through the darkness. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, his voice tight with fear. Mountain lion, maybe," Sarah suggested, but she didn't sound convinced. I unzipped the tent flap, peering out into the moonlit clearing where we'd made camp. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I saw it. Our food bag, which we'd carefully hung from a tree branch, was on the ground. Even from here, I could see it had been torn to shreds. "Guys," I said, my mouth dry, "something got into our food." We emerged from the tent cautiously, flashlights sweeping the area. The destruction was worse than I'd thought. Not only was the food bag destroyed, but our backpacks had been dragged from where we'd left them, their contents strewn across the clearing. "Bear?" Mike suggested, but I shook my head. "Bears don't scream like that," I said, remembering the chilling sound that had woken us. "Lean and look at this." My flashlight beam had landed on a nearby tree. Deep gouges ran down its trunk, easily 8 feet off the ground. Whatever had made them was big, much bigger than a black bear. Sarah gasped, pointing to something at the base of the tree. "Guys, look!" There, clearly visible in the soft earth, was a footprint, but it wasn't like any animal track I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, and seemed to show both human-like and animal characteristics. 5 toes were clearly visible, ending in what looked like sharp claw marks. "That's impossible," Mike muttered, but we all knew what we were seeing. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond our campsite, and we all whirled towards the sound. For a split second, my flashlight beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at us, eyes that were far too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. Then they were gone, leaving us alone in the suddenly too quiet forest. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Now!" No one argued. We hurriedly gathered what was left of our supplies, not bothering to pack neatly. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound made us jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, hunted. As we were stuffing the last of our gear into our packs, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the clearing. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, part bear, part big cat, but with an almost human-like quality that sent chills down my spine. "Da run!" I yelled, and we took off down the trail, our headlamps bouncing wildly in the darkness. We ran blindly, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind us, keeping pace easily. Whatever it was fast. Suddenly, Mike stumbled, crying out in pain. Sarah and I skidded to a stop, turning back to help him. "My ankle," he gasped. "And I think it's sprained." The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. In the dim light of our headlamps, I could see the terror on Sarah's face, mirroring my own. "We can't outrun it," I said, making a split-second decision. "Up there!" I pointed to a rocky outcropping just off the trail. It wasn't much, but it was high ground, and the rocks might offer some protection. Together, Sarah and I half-carried, half-dragged Mike towards it. We had just scrambled onto the rocks when our pursuer burst into view. In the confused jumble of shadows and flashlight beams, I couldn't get a clear look at it, but what I did see defied explanation. It was massive, covered in dark fur, moving on 2 legs with an unsettling mix of grace and raw power. For a moment, it seemed confused by our disappearance. Then its head swung towards our hiding spot, and I found myself staring into eyes that were far too intelligent for any ordinary animal. Time seemed to stand still as we faced each other. I could hear Sarah's ragged breathing beside me, feel Mike trembling where he leaned against my shoulder. The creature took a step forward, then another. I raised my flashlight, more as a pitiful defense than anything else. And then, just as I was sure it was going to attack, a wolf howled in the distance. The creature's head snapped towards the sound. It let out a low, frustrated growl, glanced back at us one last time, and then loped off into the darkness. We stayed frozen on those rocks for what felt like hours, straining our ears for any sign of its return. But the forest had returned to its normal nighttime sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of our situation set in. We were miles from any help, with limited supplies, and an injured member of our group. "What do we do now?" Sarah whispered. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. "We wait until dawn," I said. "And then we make for the ranger station as fast as we can." It was the longest night of my life. We huddled together on those rocks, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment the creature would return. But it didn't, and eventually the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. As soon as it was light enough to see the trail clearly, we set off. Mike's ankle was swollen and painful, but with Sarah and me supporting him on either side, we made steady progress. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the bushes made us freeze, our hearts pounding, but we saw no further sign of the creature. It took us most of the day, but we finally stumbled into the ranger station just as the sun was setting. The rangers were alarmed by our appearance. Dirty, exhausted, with Mike barely able to walk. When we told them what had happened, I could see the skepticism in their eyes. "Look," I said, pulling out my phone, "I know how it sounds, but I got a picture of the footprint." The lead ranger examined the photo, his brow furrowed. "This is..." Unusual, he admitted. We've had reports of large predator activity in that area, but nothing like this. They took our statements and promised to investigate. A search team was sent to our campsite, but they found little beyond the destruction we'd already seen. The footprint had been obscured by rain, and without clear evidence, the official report cited a possible bear encounter. But I know what I saw that night. The memory of those intelligent eyes staring at me from an impossible face still haunts my dreams. Mike, Sarah, and I don't talk about it much, but I know it changed us all. There's a weight that comes with seeing something you can't explain, something that shouldn't exist. I still go camping, still love the wilderness, but now, when night falls and the forest goes quiet, I find myself listening for that unearthly scream, watching the shadows for movement, because I know now that there are things out there, creatures that lurk on the edges of our world, defying explanation. And sometimes, if you venture too far into the wild places of the world, you might just encounter them. So if you're ever deep in the backcountry and you hear a scream that doesn't sound quite animal, quite human, my advice, run, and don't look back, because some mysteries of the wilderness are better left unsolved. As the years have passed, I've struggled with whether to share our story more widely. Part of me wants to warn others, to make them aware of the potential dangers lurking in the deep woods, but another part hesitates, knowing the ridicule and disbelief we'd likely face. Sarah threw herself into research after our encounter, poring over folklore and cryptozoology texts. She's convinced that what we saw was a creature known in various Native American legends, a sort of hybrid between man and beast. Meguish, on the other hand, rarely speaks of that night. He gave up camping altogether and moved to the city, as far from the wilderness as he could get. As for me, I find myself drawn back to Yellowstone every year, always to a different part of the park. I tell myself it's just to enjoy the beauty of nature, but deep down, I know I'm searching. For what, exactly? I'm not sure. Answers? Proof? Or maybe just another glimpse of something that challenges everything I thought I knew about the world. I've never seen the creature again, but there have been moments. A shadow moving just at the edge of my vision. A rustle in the bushes that's a little too deliberate. A feeling of being watched when I'm alone in the wilderness. It's as if, having once pulled back the veil between the known and the unknown, I can never fully close it again. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming the vast wilderness of Yellowstone. Does it remember us, I wonder? Does it tell its own story of the night it encountered strange, two-legged creatures that fled at its approach? These days, when I camp, I take extra precautions. My food is always stored in bear canisters, my tent pitched with care. But I also carry a high-quality camera, just in case. Because if I ever do see it again, I want to be ready to capture proof of something that could change our understanding of the natural world. But mostly, I find myself appreciating the mystery. In an age where it feels like every corner of the globe has been explored and explained, there's something thrilling about knowing that there are still secrets out there, still things that defy our categorizations and challenge our assumptions. So if you find yourself in the backcountry and you hear a scream that raises the hair on the back of your neck, or see a shadow that's just a little too tall, a little too human-like, remember our story. Remember that the wilderness holds mysteries we've yet to unravel, and remember that sometimes, just sometimes, legends have a way of proving themselves real. Story 19. The moment I saw it on my camera's display, I knew my life would never be the same. A blur of fur and flesh, caught in a single frame, not quite human, not quite animal. Little did I know, that photograph would lead me down a path of obsession, danger, and a confrontation with something that defied explanation. My name is Ethan Reeves, and I've been a wildlife photographer for over a decade. I've captured images of elusive creatures all over the world, from snow leopards in the Himalayas to jaguars in the Amazon. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a few weeks documenting the wildlife in a remote area of Olympic National Park. The magazine I was working for wanted a piece on the region's biodiversity, with a focus on some of the more elusive species. I'd set up camp deep in the backcountry, far from the usual tourist trails. The first few days were uneventful. I got some nice shots of elk, a few glimpses of black bears, even a stunning series of a cougar at dawn. But on the fourth night, everything changed. I was reviewing the day's photos on my camera when I noticed something strange in the background of one image. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or a trick of the light, but as I zoomed in, my heart began to race. There, partially obscured by foliage, was a figure. It was tall, much taller than a person, and covered in what looked like dark fur. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. Though blurry, I could make out features that seemed to be a disturbing mix of human and animal characteristics. I must have stared at that image for hours, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs, a person in a costume. But deep down, I knew it was neither of those things. This was something else entirely. The next morning, I packed up my gear and headed to the area where I'd taken the photo. The rational part of my brain told me I was being ridiculous, chasing shadows, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind. As I approached the spot, I noticed something odd. The underbrush was disturbed, branches broken in a way that suggested something large had moved through recently. And there, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint that made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, but it wasn't the size that unsettled me. It was the shape. It looked almost human, but with subtle differences that sent a shiver down my spine. The toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks. The arch was pronounced in a way I'd never seen in a human or animal print. I photographed the print from every angle, my hands shaking slightly as I did so. Part of me was excited. This could be the discovery of a lifetime. But another part, a more primal part, was screaming at me to pack up and get out of these woods as fast as I could. I spent the rest of the day searching the area, looking for more signs of whatever it was I'd photographed. As the sun began to set, I reluctantly headed back to my campsite, my mind racing with possibilities. That night, as I sat by my small campfire reviewing the day's photos, I heard a sound that made my heart skip a beat. It was a low, rumbling vocalization, not quite a growl, not quite speech. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the darkened forest. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of movement, something large, moving with surprising grace between the trees. Then it was gone, leaving me alone with my pounding heart and racing thoughts. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent, every snapping twig and rustling leaf magnified by my heightened senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, studied by something that was far more intelligent than any ordinary animal. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I needed to get a clear shot of whatever this creature was, not just for my own sanity, but for the world. If there really was an unknown species out here, something that could reshape our understanding of evolution and biology, I had to document it. I spent the next few days setting up camera traps around my campsite and in the area where I'd first spotted the creature. Every evening, I'd check the cameras with a mix of anticipation and dread, but they revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual forest animals going about their business. It was on the fifth night that things took a turn. I was awakened by a series of loud crashes outside my tent. Heart pounding, I unzipped the flap and peered out. What I saw froze me in place. My campsite was in disarray, backpack torn open, supplies scattered everywhere. And there, in the moonlight, stood the creature. It was even more imposing in person, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were long, ending in hands that looked unsettlingly human-like, but with sharp claws instead of nails. The face was a nightmare, a blend of ape-like features with startlingly human eyes. Those eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I felt a connection that defied explanation. There was intelligence there, curiosity even, but also something wild, something that didn't belong in this world of humans and civilization. I don't know how long we stared at each other. Seconds, minutes, time seemed to stand still. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature turned and loped off into the forest, moving with a grace that belied its size. I sat there, stunned, for what felt like hours. When I finally gathered my wits, I scrambled for my camera, but in the confusion and darkness, I hadn't managed to get a single clear shot. The next morning, I examined my campsite in the harsh light of day. The destruction was even worse than I'd thought. My expensive camera traps had been smashed, the memory cards missing. It was as if the creature had deliberately destroyed any evidence of its existence. As I stood there, surveying the wreckage of my campsite and my hopes for documenting this incredible discovery, I felt a mix of emotions. Disappointment, certainly, but also a growing sense of unease. What if this creature didn't want to be found? What if I was trespassing in a domain that humans weren't meant to enter? I packed up what was left of my gear and began the long hike back to civilization. With each step, the encounter felt more and more like a dream. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. I debated whether to tell the rangers what I'd seen. In the end, I just reported some vandalism at my campsite, claiming it was probably raccoons or bears. The skeptical looks I'd received in the past when talking about less outlandish wildlife encounters were enough to keep me quiet. Back in the city, I threw myself into research. I scoured cryptozoology forums, Native American legends, even fringe scientific journals. I found stories of similar creatures, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the skunk ape, but nothing that quite matched what I'd seen. I became obsessed, spending every free moment planning my return to the forest. I invested in better equipment, studied tracking techniques, even took a course in wildlife biology. I was determined to prove that what I'd seen was real, but as the months passed, doubt began to creep in. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Or had the isolation and the dark forest played tricks on my mind? It was a year to the day after my encounter that I finally returned to Olympic National Park. I set up camp in the same spot, my heart racing with anticipation and fear. For days, nothing happened. The forest was quiet, showing no signs of anything out of the ordinary. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it all. Then, on the fifth night, I heard it again. That low, rumbling vocalization that was neither human nor animal. I grabbed my camera and stepped out of my tent, heart pounding. There, at the edge of my campsite, stood the creature. It was just as I remembered, massive, powerful, with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. But this time, I was ready. I raised my camera and took shot after shot. The creature didn't move, didn't try to hide. It was as if it was posing, allowing me to document its existence. And then, just as before, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I was shaking as I reviewed the photos on my camera's display. They were clear, unmistakable, proof of something that would shake the foundations of science and our understanding of the natural world. But as I stared at those images, a strange feeling came over me. Did I have the right to expose this creature to the world, to subject it to the scrutiny, the exploitation that would inevitably follow? In that moment, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I deleted the photos, all of them. Some mysteries, I realized, are meant to remain mysteries. Some creatures are not meant to be catalogued and studied. They belong to the wild places, to the shadows of our world. I packed up my camp that night and left the forest for the last time. I never returned to Olympic National Park, never tried to photograph the creature again. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I think about those intelligent eyes. And I wonder if, somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, it remembers me too. Story 20. The deer carcass was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Torn apart, yes, but with a precision that sent chills down my spine. As I knelt beside it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was watching us from the dense forest, something that didn't belong in these woods. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a hunt that would turn us from predators to prey. I'm Jake Hawkins, and I've been hunting these Appalachian forests for over 2 decades. Along with my buddies, Mike and Tom, we'd come out for our annual deer hunting trip. It was supposed to be a weekend of male bonding, cold beers, and hopefully bagging a nice buck or two. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. The morning had started like any other hunting trip. We'd set out before dawn, the forest still shrouded in mist, as we made our way to our favorite spot. It was a small clearing about 5 miles from our cabin, surrounded by dense woods that always seemed to harbor the biggest bucks. We'd been in our tree stands for a couple of hours when Mike spotted the carcass. At first, we thought it was just another deer kill, probably from a mountain lion or a bear. But as we approached, we realized this was something different. The deer had been gutted with almost surgical precision. Long, deep claw marks ran along its flanks, but they didn't match any predator I knew. And the way the meat had been stripped from the bones, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. "What the hell could have done this?" Tom whispered, his face pale in the early morning light. I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years of hunting, I'd never encountered anything like this. As I examined the carcass more closely, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth nearby, was a footprint, but it wasn't from any animal I recognized. The print was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot. It seemed to have 5 toes, like a human foot, but the shape was all wrong. The toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks, and the depth of the print suggested whatever made it was incredibly heavy. "Guys," I said, my mouth dry, "take a look at this." Mike and Tom crowded around, their eyes widening as they took in the strange print. "That's not possible," Mike muttered, but we all knew what we were seeing. Just then, a twig snapped in the forest behind us. We all whirled around, rifles at the ready. The woods suddenly seemed much darker, much more menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Maybe we should head back to the cabin," Tom suggested, his voice shaky. Part of me wanted to agree, to get out of these woods as fast as possible, but curiosity and stubbornness won out. "Let's track it," I said. "Whatever did this can't be far." Mike and Tom exchanged uneasy glances, but nodded. We were hunters, after all. This is what we did. We set off into the forest, following the strange tracks. They were sporadic, appearing and disappearing, as the ground changed from soft earth to rocky terrain, but they all seemed to be heading deeper into the woods, away from any trails or known hunting grounds. As we walked, the forest seemed to close in around us. The usual sounds of birds and small animals had faded away, leaving an eerie silence broken only by our footsteps and ragged breathing. "You ever heard of any creature that could make tracks like these?" Mike asked, and his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "Nothing real," I replied. "But my granddad used to tell stories." I trailed off, not wanting to give voice to the thoughts that were creeping into my mind. Stories of creatures that walked like men, but weren't men. Beasts that lurked in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, preying on anything that crossed their path. We'd been tracking for about an hour when we came across another deer carcass. This one was fresher, the blood still wet on the leaves beneath it, and the wounds. They were identical to the first one we'd found. "It's close," I muttered, more to myself than to the others. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. It raised the hairs on my arms and sent a jolt of primal fear through my body. We stood frozen, our rifles raised, scanning the dense undergrowth. The growl came again, closer this time, and then I saw it. A flash of movement between the trees. Something big, moving with a speed and grace that defied its size. "There!" I shouted, swinging my rifle towards the movement, but it was gone before I could get a clear shot. We heard it crashing through the underbrush, circling around us. It was toying with us. I realized with a jolt of terror, whatever this thing was, it was intelligent, and it was hunting us. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice trembling. "Now." No one argued. We turned and began to make our way back the way we'd come, moving as quickly and quietly as we could, but with every step I could feel the creature's presence. It was out there, watching, waiting. We'd been walking for maybe 15 minutes when Mike suddenly stopped. "Do you guys hear that?" he whispered. We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, I caught it, the sound of breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing, coming from somewhere in the dense foliage to our right. Slowly, we turned towards the sound, and that's when I saw them. Two eyes, reflecting the dim forest light. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and they held an intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. For a long moment, we stood there, locked in a staring contest with something that shouldn't exist. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it burst from the undergrowth. I caught only glimpses as it charged. Matted fur, long limbs, a face that was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. We opened fire, our rifles thundering in the quiet forest. But if we hit it, the creature gave no sign. "Run!" I yelled, and we took off, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between us and that thing. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the green twilight of the forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me going. I could hear the creature behind us, easily keeping pace, sometimes so close I could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck. Just when I thought my heart would burst, we burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. In the center stood an old fire tower, its metal frame rusting but still intact. "Up there," I gasped, pointing at the tower. We scrambled up the metal stairs, our boots clanging on each step. We reached the small room at the top and slammed the door shut, collapsing on the floor, gasping for breath. For a few minutes, all we could do was lie there, trying to process what had just happened. Then Tom crawled to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. "I don't see anything," he said. "Maybe we lost it." But even as he spoke, we heard it, that low, rumbling growl coming from directly beneath the tower. Whatever was out there, it hadn't given up. We spent a terrifying night in that tower, taking turns watching while the others tried to rest. Every so often, we'd hear movement below, heavy footsteps circling the base of the tower, the scrape of claws on metal, but it never climbed up after us. As dawn broke, the forest fell silent. We waited for hours, but there was no further sign of the creature. Finally, desperation and thirst drove us to make a break for it. We half ran, half stumbled through the forest, jumping at every sound. But we encountered nothing out of the ordinary, and by mid-afternoon, we finally reached our cabin. We reported the incident to the local rangers, of course. They searched the area but found nothing beyond some strange tracks and the remains of the deer we'd initially discovered. The official report cited an unusual bear attack, but we knew the truth. I've been back to those woods many times since that day. I tell myself it's because I love hunting, because I won't be scared away from the forest I've known all my life. But deep down, I know the real reason. I'm looking for it. That creature. Proof that what we saw was real. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my tree stand and the forest grows quiet, I think I hear that growl again. I tell myself it's just the wind, or my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I'll see a shadow move between the trees, too tall and too quick to be a bear or a deer, and I'll remember that day and the realization that hit me as we ran for our lives. In these ancient forests, in the deep, dark places where humans rarely tread, there are still mysteries, still creatures that defy explanation, and sometimes, just sometimes, they let themselves be seen. So if you ever find yourself in the deep woods, and you come across a deer carcass that doesn't look quite right, or hear a growl that raises the hair on the back of your neck, remember my story. And remember that in the natural world, we humans aren't always the top of the food chain. Story 21. The cave mouth loomed before us like a gaping maw, ready to swallow us whole. As the first drops of rain began to fall, I knew we had no choice but to seek shelter inside. Little did we know, we were walking into a nightmare that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the natural world. My name is Sarah, and I've been an avid hiker for most of my life. I'd convinced my friends, Mark and Jess, to join me on what was supposed to be a challenging but rewarding 3-day trek through the Adirondacks. We'd planned for everything, or so we thought. The storm hit us on the afternoon of the second day. It came out of nowhere, the sky darkening so quickly it was as if someone had flipped a switch. Within minutes, we were soaked to the bone, the wind howling around us as we struggled to keep our footing on the increasingly treacherous trail. "We need to find shelter!" Mark yelled over the roar of the wind. That's when Jess spotted the cave entrance, partially hidden behind a stand of pines. We didn't hesitate. As another crack of thunder split the air, we made a dash for the cave, relief flooding through us as we ducked under its rocky overhang and out of the pounding rain. For a moment, we just stood there, catching our breath and wringing water from our clothes. The cave seemed to stretch back into darkness, the sound of dripping water echoing from somewhere deep inside. "Well, this is cozy," Jess said, trying to inject some humor into the situation, but her laugh sounded forced, and I could see the unease in her eyes as she peered into the gloom. We switched on our headlamps, the beams cutting through the darkness. The cave was larger than it had first appeared, the ceiling rising high above us and the walls stretching away into shadow. "We should probably move a bit further in," I suggested, "just in case the wind shifts and drives the rain inside." Mark and Jess nodded, and we began to make our way deeper into the cave. Our footsteps echoed strangely, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We'd gone about 50 feet when Mark suddenly stopped. "Guys," he said, his voice tight, "look at this." He was pointing at something on the cave floor. As I moved closer, I felt my heart skip a beat. There, arranged in a neat pile, were bones. Animal bones, by the look of them, picked clean and startlingly white in the beam of our headlamps. "Probably just some animal's den," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "A wolf or a bear, maybe." But even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. The bones were arranged too neatly, almost deliberately, and some of them looked too large to belong to any animal native to these mountains. We were all on edge now, our eyes darting around the cave, searching for any sign of movement in the shadows. That's when Jess noticed the markings on the wall. At first glance, they looked like ordinary cave paintings, crude stick figures and animal shapes. But as we examined them more closely, a chill ran down my spine. The figures were wrong somehow, their proportions distorted. And the animals, they didn't look like any species I'd ever seen. "What is this place?" Jess whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. Before anyone could answer, we heard it. A low, rumbling sound coming from deeper in the cave. It wasn't the growl of any animal I knew. It was deeper, almost guttural, and it sounded angry. We froze, our headlamp beams fixed on the darkness ahead of us. For a long moment there was silence. Then we heard it again, closer this time, and with it came a smell, a powerful, musky odor that made my nose wrinkle. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." No one argued. We turned and began to make our way back towards the cave entrance, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. But we'd only gone a few steps when we heard it again, that terrible rumbling growl, and this time it was behind us. I dared a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. There, at the edge of our headlamp beams, I caught a glimpse of something moving, something big. I saw matted fur, long limbs, and for a split second, a face that sent a jolt of primal terror through my body. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not quite animal, not quite human. "Run!" I screamed, and we took off, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. We tore through the cave, our feet slipping on the damp stone. I could hear it behind us, gaining ground with each passing second. Its growls echoed off the cave walls, surrounding us, disorienting us. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I saw a glimmer of daylight ahead, the cave entrance. We burst out into the rain, gasping and stumbling. "Keep going!" Mark yelled. "Don't stop!" We ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. I didn't dare look back, too afraid of what I might see. It wasn't until we'd been running for what felt like hours that we finally slowed, our bodies unable to keep up the frantic pace. We collapsed in a small clearing, our chests heaving as we gulped in air. Did we lose it?" Jess panted, her eyes wild as she scanned the trees around us. I listened intently, but all I could hear was the steady patter of rain and our own ragged breathing. Whatever had been in that cave, it didn't seem to have followed us out. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of our situation set in. We were lost, soaked to the bone, and night was falling fast. Our packs, with all our supplies, were still back in that cave. "What was that thing?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. "I've never seen anything like it." I shook my head, at a loss for words. The image of that face, if you could call it a face, was burned into my mind. It defied explanation, defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. We spent a miserable night huddled together under a makeshift shelter of pine branches, jumping at every sound. As soon as dawn broke, we set off in what we hoped was the direction of the trail, desperate to put as much distance between us and that cave as possible. It was mid-afternoon when we finally stumbled onto a ranger station. The rangers were alarmed by our appearance, muddy, scratched, and wild-eyed. When we told them what had happened, I could see the skepticism in their faces. They sent out a search party to look for our gear and investigate the cave, but they found nothing. No bones, no strange paintings, no sign of any large predator. The official report cited disorientation and possible hallucinations brought on by hypothermia and exhaustion. But I know what I saw in that cave, what we all saw. In the years since, I've researched extensively, looking for any explanation for what we encountered. I've delved into cryptozoology, folklore, even fringe scientific theories. I've found stories of similar creatures, the Wendigo of Algonquin legend, the Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest. But nothing quite matches what we saw that day. I still hike, still love the wilderness, but now, when night falls and the forest grows quiet, I find myself listening for that rumbling growl, watching the shadows for movement, because I know now that there are things out there, creatures that lurk on the edges of our world, defying explanation. Mark and Jess don't like to talk about what happened. They've convinced themselves it was all just a stress-induced hallucination. Sometimes I envy them that comfort, because I can't forget, I can't unsee that face, can't unhear that growl. I've been back to those mountains several times since that day. I tell myself it's because I love hiking, because I won't be scared away from the wilderness I've known all my life. But deep down, I know the real reason. I'm looking for that cave again. For proof that what we saw was real. I've never found it, and part of me hopes I never do. But another part needs to know. So if you're ever hiking in the deep woods, and you come across a cave that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, remember my story. Remember that in the vast wilderness of this world, there are still mysteries, still things that defy explanation. And sometimes, just sometimes, they let themselves be seen. Story 22. The first time I saw it on the security camera footage, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A massive, fur-covered figure, moving with an eerie grace that belied its size. But as the attacks on my livestock continued and the evidence mounted, I was forced to confront a terrifying reality. Something out of legend was stalking my farm. My name is Frank Collins, and I've been running my family's cattle ranch in northern Montana for over 3 decades. I've dealt with my fair share of predators over the years, wolves, mountain lions, even the occasional bear, but nothing could have prepared me for what began haunting my land last summer. It started with a few missing calves. At first, I assumed it was just coyotes or maybe a bold mountain lion, but then I found the carcasses. They were torn apart in a way I'd never seen before, with a strength that seemed impossible for any known predator in these parts. After the third attack, I decided to set up some trail cameras around the property. I'd used them before to track wildlife movements, but this time I had a feeling I was dealing with something different. For weeks, the cameras caught nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual deer, coyotes, and the occasional elk. But then, on a moonlit night in late August, everything changed. I was reviewing the footage the next morning, coffee in hand, when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but as I watched, my coffee cup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. The creature moved like no bear I'd ever seen. It was bipedal, walking upright with a fluid, almost human-like gait. But it was huge, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, and its face, I couldn't make out the details clearly, but what I could see sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the face of any animal I recognized. I replayed the footage over and over, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera, but deep down, I knew what I was seeing. It was something that shouldn't exist, something straight out of the campfire stories my grandfather used to tell. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? I'd be laughed off my own land. Instead, I threw myself into research, spending long nights poring over local legends, cryptozoology websites, anything that might give me a clue about what I was dealing with. The attacks continued, growing bolder. Whatever this creature was, it was getting more comfortable on my land. I started sleeping with a loaded rifle by my bed, jumping at every sound in the night. It was about a month after that first sighting when I caught it on camera again. This time, the image was clearer. I could see the intelligence in its eyes, the way it seemed to be studying its surroundings. It wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. This thing was smart. That's when I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit back and watch my livelihood be destroyed, but I also knew I couldn't face this thing alone. I swallowed my pride and my fear of ridicule and went to see Sheriff Tom Hawkins. Tom and I had known each other since we were kids, and if anyone would listen to me without immediately calling the psych ward, it was him. I laid it all out for Tom, the attacks, the footage, my suspicions. To his credit, he listened without interrupting, his face growing more serious with each passing minute. "Frank," he said when I'd finished, "I've known you a long time. You're not the type to make up stories or see things that aren't there. If you say something's out there, I believe you." The relief I felt at those words was overwhelming. Finally, someone else knew. I wasn't in this alone anymore. Tom agreed to increase patrols around my property, and he put me in touch with a wildlife expert from the state university. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived a week later, her skepticism evident in the set of her jaw and the furrow of her brow. But that skepticism vanished the first night she spent on my property. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dr. Chen's face went pale. That's not possible," she whispered. We spent the next few days setting up more cameras, taking plaster casts of the strange footprints we found around the property. Dr. Chen's excitement grew with each piece of evidence we uncovered. "And if this is what I think it is, Cut," she told me one evening, her eyes shining, "we could be on the verge of the zoological discovery of the century." But as the days passed and we caught more glimpses of the creature, a growing sense of unease settled over me. This wasn't some animal to be studied and classified. It was something else, something that straddled the line between the world I knew and something other. It all came to a head on a moonless night in late September. I was in the barn, checking on a pregnant heifer, when I heard the commotion outside. The cattle were bellowing in terror, and beneath their cries, I heard that now familiar growl. I grabbed my rifle and ran outside. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw it, the creature, larger and more terrifying than I could have imagined. It was hunched over one of my cattle, but at my approach it turned. For a moment we stared at each other. Its eyes reflected the light of my flashlight, glowing with an unnatural intelligence. I raised my rifle, but something stopped me from pulling the trigger. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was a sudden, stark realization. This creature was as much a part of this land as I was, maybe more so. The moment stretched, taut as a wire. Then, with a speed that defied its size, the creature turned and loped off into the darkness. I stood there, my heart pounding, as the reality of what had just happened washed over me. I'd come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. In the days that followed, Dr. Chen and Sheriff Tom tried to convince me to go public with what we'd discovered. They talked about fame, about changing the course of scientific understanding, but I found myself reluctant. Yes, we had evidence, footprints, fur samples, even some blurry video footage. But as I looked out over my land, at the forests and mountains that had been my home for so long, I realized something. This creature, whatever it was, had been here long before me. It had managed to stay hidden, to become the stuff of legend rather than scientific fact. Maybe that's how it was meant to be. In the end, I made a decision that I'm still not sure was the right one. I asked Dr. Chen and Sheriff Tom to keep quiet about what we'd seen. I destroyed the footage, buried the plaster casts of the footprints. Some might call it a cover-up, might say I had a responsibility to share what we'd discovered with the world. But standing there on my porch, looking out at the wilderness where I knew that creature still roamed, I felt a sense of respect. Respect for a being that had managed to survive, to thrive, in a world that increasingly had no place for mysteries. The attacks on my livestock stopped after that night. Sometimes, when I'm out checking the fences or bringing in the herd, I feel eyes on me. I'll catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, hear a rustle in the underbrush that's too deliberate to be the wind. And on rare nights, when the moon is full and the air is crisp with the promise of winter, I'll hear that growl again. It no longer fills me with fear. Instead, it reminds me that the world is bigger, more wondrous, and more mysterious than we can ever truly understand. I still run my ranch. I still tend my cattle. But now, I do it with the knowledge that I share this land with something extraordinary, something that blurs the line between legend and reality. So if you ever find yourself in the wilds of Montana, and you hear a sound that raises the hair on the back of your neck, or see a shadow move in a way that defies explanation, remember my story. Remember that in this vast wilderness, there are still secrets. Still wonders. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get a glimpse of them. Story 23. The first footprint I found was so large, I initially mistook it for a small pond, but as I knelt beside it, my heart racing, I realized I was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and my place in it. My name is Dr. Emily Thorne, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large mammal behavior. I've spent the last decade tracking and studying everything from grizzlies in Alaska to tigers in India. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. It all started with reports from local hikers and campers about strange noises in the night and unusually large tracks found in muddy areas. Most of my colleagues dismissed these stories as exaggerations or misidentifications, but something about the consistency of the reports intrigued me. I decided to mount a small expedition to investigate. I assembled a team of 3, myself, my research assistant Jake, and a local guide named Tom, who knew these woods like the back of his hand. We set out on a crisp autumn morning, the forest ablaze with fall colors. The plan was to spend a week in the backcountry, setting up camera traps and collecting any physical evidence we could find. The first few days were uneventful. We found some large tracks, but nothing that couldn't be explained by known wildlife. But on the 4th day, everything changed. We were hiking along a small stream when I spotted it, a footprint in the soft mud of the bank that stopped me in my tracks. It was enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot, but it wasn't just the size that unsettled me. The shape was all wrong. It looked almost human, but with subtle differences that sent a chill down my spine. "Jake, Tom, come look at this," I called, my voice shaky. They crowded around, their eyes widening as they took in the print. That's not possible," Jake muttered. Tom said nothing, but I saw him make a subtle warding gesture, his face pale. I took measurements and photographs, my scientific mind warring with the part of me that was screaming that this couldn't be real. The print was fresh. Whatever had made it had passed through recently. We decided to follow the tracks. They led us deeper into the forest, away from any marked trails. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, the rustle of small animals, had faded away, leaving an eerie silence. After about an hour of tracking, we came to a small clearing. What we found there made us all stop short. The ground was covered in flattened vegetation, forming a rough circle about 20 feet in diameter. It looked for all the world like a nest. "Dr. Thorne," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what could make something like this?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. My mind was racing through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. A bear's daybed. But bears don't make nests like this. Some kind of primate, but there were no known primates in this part of the world that could create something on this scale. As we examined the nest, taking samples and photographs, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the trees around us. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. We all froze, our eyes darting around the clearing. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement in the undergrowth, something large, moving with a grace that belied its size. "We need to leave," Tom said, his voice tight with fear. "And now?" But even as he spoke, I knew it was too late. We were in its territory now. The creature emerged from the trees with a speed that seemed impossible for its bulk. My first impression was of sheer size. It towered over us, easily 8 or 9 feet tall. It was covered in thick, dark fur, but its body structure was unnervingly human-like, and its face, I'll never forget that face, as long as I live. It was a nightmarish blend of ape and human features, with eyes that held an intelligence that shook me to my core. For a long moment, we all stood frozen, staring at each other. I could hear Jake's ragged breathing beside me, see Tom's hand inching towards the knife at his belt, but I couldn't move, couldn't even think of running. I was transfixed by those eyes, by the impossible reality of what stood before us. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and loped back into the forest, moving faster than anything that size had a right to. Within seconds, it had vanished among the trees, leaving us alone in the clearing. We stood in stunned silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice shaky. "What? What was that?" I shook my head, my scientific mind struggling to process what we'd just seen. "I don't know," I admitted, "but whatever it was, it shouldn't exist." We made our way back to our camp in a daze, jumping at every sound. That night, Huddled around our campfire, we debated what to do. Jake was all for packing up and leaving immediately, while Tom sat in stoic silence, occasionally making those warding gestures I'd seen earlier. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. We had evidence. The footprint casts, the samples from the nest, our own eyewitness accounts. This could be the zoological discovery of the century. I had to know more. We spent the next 2 days combing the area, setting up more camera traps and collecting every scrap of evidence we could find. We didn't see the creature again, but its presence was palpable. More than once, I caught a glimpse of movement just at the edge of my vision, or heard that low, rumbling growl in the distance. On our last night in the forest, as we sat around the campfire, Tom finally opened up. He told us stories he'd heard from his grandfather, tales of a creature that walked like a man, but wasn't a man. The old stories called it Sasquatch or Bigfoot. My people have known about them for generations, he said, his eyes reflecting the firelight. We leave them alone, and they leave us alone. That's the way it's always been. I thought about the creature we'd seen, about the intelligence in its eyes. If these beings had existed alongside humans for so long, how had they remained hidden? And what would it mean for our understanding of evolution, of human history, if their existence was confirmed? As we hiked out of the forest the next day, my mind was swirling with questions and possibilities. I knew that what we'd discovered would be controversial, that many in the scientific community would dismiss our findings outright. But I also knew that I couldn't simply walk away from this. In the months that followed, I threw myself into research. I analyzed our samples, pored over historical records and local legends, and reached out to other researchers who had reported similar encounters. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of a species that had managed to survive alongside humans while remaining largely hidden from sight. But the more I learned, the more conflicted I felt. Part of me, the scientist, wanted to shout our discovery from the rooftops. This could revolutionize our understanding of primate evolution, of human history. But another part of me, the part that had looked into those intelligent eyes in the forest, hesitated. If we revealed the existence of these creatures to the world, what would happen to them? Would they be hunted, studied, their habitat destroyed in the name of science or curiosity? In the end, I made a decision that I'm still not sure was the right one. I published a paper, but I was vague about the location of our discovery. I presented our evidence, but I held back some of the more compelling photographs and samples, enough to spark interest and further research, but not enough to lead to an immediate, full-scale expedition into those forests. My colleagues called me crazy. Some accused me of fraud, others of professional jealousy. But a very few, reached out privately, sharing their own stories of unexplained encounters in the wilderness. As for me, I've returned to those forests many times since that first expedition. I've caught fleeting glimpses of the creatures, found more evidence of their existence, but I've never again had an encounter like that first one. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the wilderness, I feel eyes on me. I'll hear a rustle in the undergrowth that's too deliberate to be the wind, or catch a whiff of a musky odor that doesn't belong to any known animal. And I'm reminded that the world is bigger, more mysterious, and more wondrous than we can ever truly comprehend. So if you find yourself in the deep woods and you come across a footprint that's too big to be human, or hear a sound that raises the hair on the back of your neck, remember my story. Remember that there are still mysteries in this world, still discoveries to be made, and sometimes, just sometimes, the legends turn out to be true. Story 24. The ripples on the lake's surface were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. At first, I thought it was just a large fish, but as the water parted and a massive, dark shape emerged, I realized we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding, something that would change our lives forever. My name is Jack Thompson, and I've been fishing these waters for over 40 years. Along with my buddies, Mike and Dave, we've made an annual pilgrimage to Lake Obscura, a remote body of water nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains. It's always been our secret spot, far from the tourist trails and known only to a handful of locals. This year's trip started like any other. We loaded up our old pickup with gear, stocked the cooler with beer and bait, and set out before dawn. The drive was familiar, winding mountain roads giving way to rougher logging trails, until finally we reached the overgrown path that led to our favorite camping spot on the lake's eastern shore. As we set up camp, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the air heavy with an expectation I couldn't quite name. Mike and Dave felt it too, though none of us wanted to admit it. "Maybe we're just getting old," Dave joked as we launched our small boat, starting to jump at shadows. We spent the morning fishing, but the lake seemed oddly empty. Not a single bite, not even a ripple to suggest there was anything alive beneath the placid surface. As the sun climbed higher, the silence became oppressive. It was just after noon when we saw it for the first time. A disturbance in the water, far larger than any fish should make. A dark shape just below the surface, moving with a speed and grace that defied its apparent size. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, his rod forgotten in his hands. Before anyone could answer, the shape disappeared into the depths. We exchanged uneasy glances, each of us wondering if we'd really seen what we thought we had. As the afternoon wore on, we saw it several more times, always at a distance, always just a glimpse before it vanished. With each sighting, the tension in our little boat ratcheted up a notch. "Maybe we should head back to shore," Dave suggested as the sun began to dip towards the mountains. "Whatever that thing is, I don't want to be out here after dark." I nodded, relief washing over me at the suggestion. As much as I hated to admit it, I was scared. In all my years on this lake, I'd never encountered anything like this. We were about halfway back to our campsite when it happened. A massive shape erupted from the water, no more than 20 feet from our boat. In the fading light, I caught a glimpse of a long serpentine neck, a head that seemed too small for the body, and eyes, God, those eyes, that looked far too intelligent for any fish or reptile. The creature hung there for a moment, water cascading off its dark, sleek body. Then, with a grace that belied its size, it slid back beneath the surface, leaving us in a wake that nearly capsized our small craft. We made it back to shore in record time, our hands shaking as we secured the boat. None of us spoke as we built up the campfire, each lost in our own thoughts about what we'd seen. It wasn't until we'd each downed a couple of beers that Dave finally broke the silence. "So, we're all agreed on what we saw, right? That wasn't a fish, or a gator, or anything else that's supposed to be in this lake." Mike and I nodded, relief evident on our faces. At least we weren't going crazy alone. "What do we do?" Mike asked. "Report it." I considered this for a moment. Who would believe us? We don't have any proof. They'd laugh us out of town. We fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the lapping of waves on the shore. As darkness fell, the sounds from the lake changed. Splashes that were too big to be fish. A low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. None of us slept much that night. We took turns keeping watch, though what we thought we could do against a creature of that size, I don't know. As dawn broke, we were exhausted, jumpy, and no closer to understanding what we were dealing with. Over a meager breakfast of coffee and power bars, none of us had the stomach for anything more substantial. We debated our next move. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but another part, the part that had spent a lifetime on this lake, needed to know more. "One more day," I suggested. "We set up cameras on the shore, try to get some evidence. If we see anything else, anything at all, we leave." Agreed. Mike and Dave exchanged glances, then nodded reluctantly. We spent the morning setting up our equipment, an old video camera, a couple of smartphones rigged to take time-lapse photos, anything we could think of to capture proof of what we'd seen. The day passed slowly, tension building with each hour. We saw nothing, not even a ripple to suggest the creature was still in the lake. As the sun began to set, I could see the relief on Mike and Dave's faces. Maybe it had all been a collective hallucination, a trick of light and shadow on the water. But as darkness fell, the sounds began again, that low, rumbling noise, closer now, splashes that sent waves lapping against the shore. And then, in the beam of our spotlight, we saw it. The creature rose from the water no more than 50 feet from where we stood. In the harsh, artificial light, it looked even more impossible than it had in the fading sun. Its body was sleek, almost eel-like, but far larger than any eel had a right to be. The head was reptilian, with eyes that reflected the light in a way that made them seem to glow from within. For a long moment, it regarded us, and we stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Then slowly, deliberately, it began to move towards the shore, towards us. The cameras, I managed to croak out, "Are they getting this?" Mike nodded mutely, his eyes never leaving the approaching creature. It came to a stop just at the water's edge, its long neck extending to bring its head almost to our level. This close, I could see every detail. The scales that covered its body, the sharp teeth visible as its mouth opened slightly, the intelligence that burned in those impossible eyes. And then it made a sound, not the rumbling noise we'd heard before, but something almost musical, a series of clicks and whistles that sent shivers down my spine. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we stood there, locked in a staring contest with something that shouldn't exist. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and slid back into the depths, leaving us alone on the shore with our racing hearts and our useless cameras. We didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as dawn broke, we packed up our camp and headed out, our fishing trip forgotten. The drive back to town was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd experienced. It wasn't until we were back in the familiar surroundings of Joe's diner, cups of coffee warming our hands, that we finally talked about what to do next. "We have the footage," Mike said. "We could go public, tell everyone what's in that lake." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Who would believe us? And if they did, what would happen to the lake, to the creature? In the end, we made a decision that I'm still not sure was the right one. We kept quiet. We didn't share the footage, didn't tell anyone what we'd seen. Maybe it was fear of ridicule, or maybe it was something deeper, a sense that some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. We've been back to Lake Obscura many times since that night. We've never seen the creature as clearly as we did that first time, but we've caught glimpses. A ripple here, a shadow there, and always, as night falls, we hear that haunting, musical call echoing across the water. Sometimes, I wonder if we did the right thing by keeping our discovery secret. But then I think about that creature, living peacefully in its secluded lake, free from the prying eyes of the world. And I realize that some wonders are best left undisturbed. So if you ever find yourself on the shores of a remote mountain lake and you see a ripple that's too big to be a fish, or hear a sound that sends shivers down your spine, remember our story. Remember that the world is vast and mysterious, and that sometimes the old legends turn out to be true. And if you're very, very lucky, you might just catch a glimpse of something wonderful.